Section 20 of History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Katie Francesca. History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890 by Alexander and George Sutherland. South Australia, 1850 to 1890. 1. Temporary decline. In 1851, the prosperity of South Australia was somewhat dimmed by the discovery of gold in Victoria, for before the middle of the following year, the colony was deserted by a very large proportion of its male inhabitants. The copper mines were with difficulty worked, for want of men. The fields were uncultivated, the sheep untended, and the colony experienced a short period of rapid decline. However, the results obtained on the gold fields by most of these fortune seekers were hardly to be compared with the steady yield of the fertile cornfields and rich copper mines of South Australia, and the majority of those who had thus abandoned the colony returned in a short time to their families and their former employments. Governor Young adroitly turned the discovery of gold to the advantage of his own colony by establishing an escort between Bendigo and Adelaide, and, as this was remarkably well equipped, many of the diggers sent their gold by this route rather than to Melbourne, thus giving to South Australia some of the advantages of a gold-producing country. The crowds of people rushing to the goldfields had carried with them nearly all the coins of the colony and the banks, although they had plenty of rough gold, were yet unable, from scarcity of coined money, to meet the demands upon them. In this emergency, Sir Henry Young took the extreme and somewhat illegal step of instituting a new currency consisting of gold cast into small bars or ingots, and, although afterwards mildly censured by the Home Government for exceeding his powers, yet he could justly assert that this measure had saved the colony from serious commercial disaster. But South Australia was still more benefited by the great market open for its flour and wheat among the vast crowds on the goldfields, and, when the first period of excitement was over, it was found that the colony was, at any rate, not a loser by the success of its neighbours. 2. The Real Property Act. In 1858, South Australia took the lead in a reform which is now being adopted by nearly all the civilised nations of the world. According to English law, each time an estate was transferred from one person to another, a deed had to be made out for the purpose, and if changes in its ownership had been frequent, it would be held by the last purchaser in virtue of a long series of documents. Now, if anyone wished to buy a piece of land, he was obliged for safety to examine all the preceding deeds in order to be quite certain that they were valid. Even then, if he bought the land and another person, for any reason whatever, laid claim to it, the owner had to prove the validity of each of a long series of documents, going back perhaps for centuries. A flaw in any one of these would give rise to a contest which could be settled only after a very tedious investigation, and thus arose the long and ruinous chancery suits which were the disgrace of English law. When a man's title to his estate was disputed, it often happened that he had to spend a fortune and waste half a lifetime in protracted litigation before all the antecedent deeds could be proved correct. Mr. R. Torrens had his attention drawn to this very unsatisfactory state of things by the ruin of one of his relatives in a chancery suit. He thought long and carefully over a scheme to prevent the occurrence of such injustice and drafted a bill for a new method of transferring property. He proposed to lay this before the South Australian Parliament, but his friends discouraged him by declaring it was impossible to make so sweeping a change, and the lawyers actively opposed any innovation. But Torrens brought forward the bill. Its simplicity and justice commended themselves to the people and to the House of Assembly, and it was carried by a large majority. According to the new scheme, all transferences of land were to be registered in a public office called the Lands Titles Office. The purchaser's name was to be recorded and a certificate of title given to him. After this, his right to the property was indisputable. If his possession was challenged, he had to simply go to the Lands Titles Office and produce his certificate to the officer in charge, who could turn to the register and at once decide the question of ownership. After this, no dispute was possible. If he sold his land, his name was cancelled in the public register and the buyer's name was inserted instead, when he became the undisputed owner. Mr. Torrens was appointed to be registrar of the office and soon made the new system a great success. It was adopted one after another in all the colonies of Australia and must become eventually the law of all progressive nations. 3. The Northern Territory. In 1864, the Northern Territory was added to the Dominion of South Australia, and from Adelaide, an expedition was dispatched by sea to the shores of Van Diemen's Gulf in order to form a new settlement. After many difficulties, caused chiefly by the disputes between the first government resident, or superintendent, and the officers under him, a branch colony was successfully founded at Port Darwin, opposite to Melville Island. This settlement has become a prosperous one. All the fruits and grains of tropical countries flourish and thrive to perfection. Gold has been discovered, and it is asserted that there exist in the neighbourhood rich mines of other metals, which will, in the future, yield great wealth, while the stations that are now being formed are peculiarly favourable to the rearing of cattle and of horses. Yet the number of people who settle there continues small on account of the very hot climate. Palmerston, the capital, is as yet a town of only a few hundred inhabitants, and all the really hard work of the district is done by Chinese. 4. Overland Telegraph. In a previous chapter, it has been described how Maudoul Stewart, after 2 unsuccessful efforts, managed to cross the continent from Adelaide to Van Diemen's Gulf. Along the route which he then took, the people of South Australia resolved to construct a telegraph line. A gentleman named Charles Todd had frequently urged the desirability of such a line, and in 1869 his representations led to the formation of the British Australian Telegraph Company, which engaged to lay a submarine cable from Singapore to Van Diemen's Gulf, whilst the South Australian government pledged itself to connect Port Darwin with Adelaide by an overland line, and undertook to have the work finished by the 1st of January 1872. Mr. Todd was appointed superintendent and divided the whole length into 3 sections, reserving the central portion for his own immediate direction, and entrusting the sections at the 2 ends to contractors. It was a daring undertaking for so young a colony. For 1,300 miles the line would have to be carried through country which never before had been traversed by any white man but Stuart's party. Great tracts of this land were utterly destitute of trees, and all the posts required for the line had to be carted through rocky deserts and over treacherous sandhills. Todd had, with wonderful skill and energy, completed his difficult portion of the task, and the part nearest to Adelaide had also been finished before the time agreed upon. But it fared differently with those who had undertaken to construct the northern section. Their horses died, their provisions failed, and the whole attempt proved a miserable collapse. The government sent a party to the north in order to make a fresh effort. Wells were dug at intervals along the route, and great teams of bullocks were employed to carry the necessary provisions and materials to the stations. And yet, in spite of every precaution, The result was a failure. Meanwhile, the cable had been laid and the first message sent from Port Darwin to England announced that the overland telegraph was not nearly finished. The 1st of January 1872 being now close at hand, Mr. Todd was hastily sent to complete the work. But the time agreed upon had expired before he had even made a commencement, and the company threatened to sue the South Australian government for damages on account of the losses sustained by its failure to perform its share of the contract. For the next 8 months, the work was energetically carried forward. Mr. Todd rode all along the line to see that its construction was satisfactory throughout. He was at Central Mount Stewart in the month of August when the two ends of the wire were joined and the first telegraphic message flashed across the Australian continent. But, meantime, a flaw had occurred in the submarine cable, and it was not until October that communication was established with England. On the 2nd day of that month, the Lord Mayor of London, standing at one end of the line, sent his hearty congratulations through 12,500 miles of wire to the Mayor of Adelaide, who conversed with him in the other extremity. The whole work was undertaken and accomplished within 2 years, and already not only South Australia, but all the colonies are reaping the greatest benefits from this enterprising effort. Another undertaking of a similar character has been completed by the efforts of both South and West Australia. Along the barren coast on which Eyre so nearly perished, there stretches a long line of posts which carries a telegraph wire from Perth to Adelaide. A period of depression began in South Australia after 1882. For a time, everything was against the colony. Long droughts killed its sheep and ruined its crops, while the copper mines were found to be worked out. But fortune began to smile again after a few years of dull times, and when in 1887 an exhibition was held in Adelaide to commemorate the Jubilee of the colony, it was also the commemoration of the return of brighter prospects. In the growth of wheat and fruits, as well as in the making of wine, South Australia has great openings for future prosperity. End of section 20. Recording by Katie Francesca. Section 21 of History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Katie Francesca. History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890 by Alexander and George Sutherland. New South Wales, 1860 to 1890. 1. The Land Act. Sir John Young became Governor of New South Wales in 1861. He was a man of great talent, but at this stage of the colony's history, the ability of the governor made very little difference in the general progress of affairs. The political power was now chiefly in the hands of responsible ministers, and without their advice, the governor could do nothing. The ministry of the period, headed by Charles Cowper and John Robertson, prepared a bill to alter the regulations for the sale of land, and to give to the poor man an opportunity of obtaining a small farm on easy terms. Any person who declared his readiness to live on his land and to cultivate it was to be allowed to select a portion, not exceeding a certain size, in any part of the colony which he thought most convenient. The land was not to be given gratuitously, but although the selector was to pay for it at the rate of £1 per acre, yet he was not expected to give more than a quarter of the price on taking possession. 3 years afterwards he had the option of either paying at once for the remaining 3/4, or, if this were beyond his means, of continuing to hold the land at a yearly rental of 1 shilling an acre. This was an excellent scheme for the poorer class of farmers, but it was not looked upon with favour by the squatters, whose runs were only rented from the state, and were therefore liable under this new act to be invaded by selectors, who would pick out all the more fertile portions, break up the runs in an awkward manner, and cause many annoyances. Hence, though the Legislative Assembly passed the bill, the Upper House, whose members were mostly squatters, very promptly rejected it, and upon this there arose a struggle, the Ministry being determined to carry the bill, and the Council quite as resolute never to pass it. Acting on the advice of his ministers, Sir John Young entreated the Upper House to give way, but it was deaf to all persuasions, and the ministers determined to coerce it by adopting extreme measures. Its members had been nominated by a previous governor for a period of 5 years as a preliminary trial before the nominations for life. The term of their appointment was now drawing to a close, and Sir John Young, by waiting some little time, might easily have appointed a new council of his own way of thinking. But the ministers were impatient to have their measure passed, and instead of waiting, they advised the governor to nominate 21 new members of council, who, being all supporters of the bill, would give them a majority in the Upper House, so that on the very last night of its existence, it would be obliged to pass the measure and make it law. But when the opponents of the bill saw the trick which was being played upon them, they rose from their seats and resigned in a body. The President himself vacated his chair, and as no business could then be carried on, the Land Bill was delayed until the council came to an end, and the ministers thus found themselves outwitted. They were able, somewhat later, to effect their purpose, but this little episode in responsible government caused considerable stir at the time, and Sir John subsequently received a rebuke from the Colonial Secretary for his share in it. 2. Prince Alfred. In 1868, Lord Belmore became Governor of New South Wales, and during his term of office, all the colonies passed through a period of excitement on the occasion of a visit from the Queen's second son, Prince Alfred. He was the first of the royal family who had ever visited Australia, and the people gave to him a hearty and enthusiastic reception. As he entered, the city's flower-decked arches spanned the streets, crowds of people gathered by day to welcome him, and at night the houses and public buildings were brilliantly illuminated in his honour. But during the height of the festivities at Sydney, a circumstance occurred which cast a gloom over the whole of Australia. The prince had accepted an invitation to a picnic at Clontarf, and was walking quietly on the sands to view the various sports of the holiday-makers, when a young man named O'Farrell rushed forward and discharged a pistol at him. The ball entered his back, and he fell dangerously wounded. For a day or two, his life trembled in the balance, and the colonists awaited the result with the greatest excitement, until it was made known that the crisis was past. No reason was alleged for the crime except a blind dislike to the royal family, and O'Farrell was subsequently tried and executed. 3. Railway construction. New South Wales has 3 main lines of railway, with many branches. One starts from Sydney and passes through Goulburn to Albury on its way to Melbourne. One goes north to Newcastle, then through the New England district and so to Brisbane. And the third runs from Sydney over the Blue Mountains to Bathurst and away to Bourke on the Darling River. Those rugged heights which so long opposed the westward progress of the early colonists have proved no insuperable barrier to the engineer, and the locomotive now slowly puffs up the steep inclines and drags its long line of heavily laden trucks where Macquarie's Road, with so much trouble, was carried in 1815. The first difficulty which had to be encountered was at a long valley named Knapsack Gully. Here, the rails had to be laid on a great viaduct where the trains run above the tops of the tallest trees. The engineers had next to undertake the formidable task of conducting the line up a steep and rocky incline, 700 feet in height. This was effected by cutting a zigzag in the rock. The trains run first to the left, rising upon a slight incline, then, reversing, they go to the right, still mounting slightly upwards, then again to the left, and so on, till the summit is reached. By these means the short distance is rendered long, but the abrupt steepness of the hill is reduced to a gentle incline. The trains afterwards run along the top of the ridge, gradually rising till at the highest point they are 3,500 feet above the level of the Sydney station. The passengers look down from the mountain tops on the forest-clad valleys far below. They speed along vast embankments or dash through passages cut in the solid rock, whose sides tower above them to the height of an ordinary steeple. In some places, long tunnels were bored, so that the trains now enter a hill at one side and emerge from the other. One of these tunnels was thought to be unsafe. The immense mass of rock above it seemed likely to crush downwards upon the passage, and the engineers thought that their best course would be to remove the hill from above it. 3.5 tons of gunpowder were placed at intervals in the tunnel, and connected by wires with a galvanic battery placed a long distance off. The operation of firing the mine was made a public occasion, and Lady Belmore agreed to go up to the mountains and perform the ceremony of removing the hill. When all was ready, she touched the knob which brought the two ends of wire together. A dull and rumbling sound was heard. The solid rock heaved slowly upward and then settled back to its place, broken in 1,000 pieces and covered with rolling clouds of dust and smoke. All that the workmen had then to do was to carry away the immense pile of stone, and the course was clear for laying the rails. When the line reached the other side of the Blue Mountains, there were great difficulties in the descent, and here the engineers had to lay out zigzags of greater extent than the former. By these, the trains now descend easily and safely from the tops of the mountains down into the Lithgow Valley far below. By the Southern Railway to Albury, crowds of people are daily whirled in a few hours to places which, 40 years ago, were reached by Sturt and Hume and Mitchell, only after weeks of patient toil through unknown lands that were far removed from civilization. 4. Sydney Exhibition. So on every hand the colony made progress. Her railways expanded in scores of branches. Her telegraph lines stretched out their arms in every direction. Her sheep increased so that now there are nearly 60 millions of them. Her wheat and maize extended to more than 500,000 of acres. Her orangeries and vineyards and orchards, her mines of coal and tin, and her varied and extensive manufactures make her people, now numbering 1 million, one of the most prosperous on the face of the earth. Her pride was pardonable when, in 1879, she held an international exhibition to compare her industries side by side with those of other lands, so as to show how much she had done and to discover how much she had yet to learn. A frail but wonderfully pretty building rapidly arose on the brow of the hill between Sydney Cove and Farm Cove, and that place, the scene of so much squalor and misery 100 years before, became gay with all that decorative art could do, and busy with daily throngs of gratified visitors. The place had a most distinguished appearance. Seen from the harbour, its dome and fluttering flags rose up from among the luxuriant foliage of the Botanic Gardens, as if boldly to proclaim that New South Wales had completed the period of her infancy and was prepared to take her place among the nations as one grown to full and comely proportions. When the building had served its purpose, the people were too fond and too proud of it to dismantle and destroy it. But, unfortunately, it was not long after swept away by an accidental fire. In 1885, the colony was stirred by a great wave of enthusiasm when it was known that its government had sent to England the offer of a regiment of soldiers to fight in the Sudan, side by side with British troops. The offer was accepted, and some 700 or 800 soldiers, well equipped and full of high hopes, sailed for Africa. The war was too soon over for them to have any chance of displaying what an Australian force may be like upon a battlefield. There were many persons who held that the whole expedition was a mistake, but it had one good effect, for it showed that, for the present at least, the Australian colonies are proud of their mother country, that their eyes are fondly turned to her, to follow all her destinies in that great career which she has to accomplish as the leading nation of the earth, and that if she ever needed their help, assistance would flow spontaneously from the fullness of loving hearts. The idea of this expedition and its execution belonged principally to C.B. Daly, but the great leader of New South Wales during the last quarter of a century and the most zealous worker for its welfare and prosperity has been the veteran statesman Sir Henry Parkes. End of section 21. Recording by Katie Francesca. Section 22 of History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Katie Francesca. History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890 by Alexander and George Sutherland. Victoria, 1855 to 1890. 1. Responsible government. In 1855, when each of the colonies was engaged in framing for itself its own form of government, Victoria, like all the others, chose the English system of 2 houses of legislature. At first it was resolved that the lower house, called the Legislative Assembly, should consist of only 60 members, but by subsequent additions the number has been increased to 86. In 1857, the right of voting was conferred upon every man who had resided a sufficient length of time in the colony. With regard to the upper house, Victoria found the same difficulty as had been experienced in New South Wales, but instead of introducing the system of nomination by the government, it decided that its legislative council should be elected by the people. In order, however, that this body might not be identical in form and opinion with the lower house, it was arranged that no one should be eligible for election to it who did not possess at least £5,000 worth of real property, and that the privilege of voting should be confined to the wealthier part of the community. Along with this new constitution, responsible government was introduced, and Mr. Haynes, being sent for by the governor, formed the first ministry. Before the close of the year, the first contest under the new system took place. Mr. Neilson, a member of the Assembly, moved that the voting for elections should in future be carried on in secret by means of the ballot box, so that every man might be able to give his opinion undeterred by any external pressure, such as the fear of displeasing his employer or of disobliging a friend. The government of Mr. Haynes refused its assent to this proposal, which was nevertheless carried by the Assembly. Now, the system of responsible government required that, in such a case, Mr. Haynes and his fellow ministers, being averse to such a law and declining to carry it out, should resign and leave the government to those who were willing and able to inaugurate the newly appointed system. Accordingly, they gave in their resignations, and the governor asked Mr. Neilson to form a new ministry. But, though many members had voted for his proposal, they were not prepared to follow him as their leader. He could obtain very few associates, and was thus unable to form a ministry, so that there appeared some likelihood of a total failure of responsible government before it had been 6 months in existence. In the midst of this crisis, Sir Charles Hotham was taken ill. He had been present at a prolonged ceremony, the opening of the first gasworks in Melbourne, and a cold south wind had given him a dangerous chill. He lay for a day or two in great danger, but the crisis seemed past, and he had begun to recover, when news was brought to him of Mr. Neilson's failure. He lay brooding over these difficulties, which pressed so much upon his mind that he was unable to rally, and on the last day of the year 1855, he died. This was a great shock to the colonists, who had learned highly to respect him. The vacant position was for a year assumed by Major General MacArthur, who invited Mr. Haynes and his ministry to return. They did so, and the course of responsible government began again from the beginning. At the end of 1856, another governor, Sir Henry Berkeley, arrived, and during the 7 years of his stay, the new system worked smoothly enough, the only peculiarity being the rapid changes in the government. Some of the ministries lasted only 6 weeks, and very few protracted their existence to a year. 2. The deadlock. Sir Henry Berkeley left the colony in 1863, and his place was immediately filled by Sir Charles Darling, nephew of Sir Ralph Darling, who, 40 years before, had been Governor of New South Wales. Sir Charles was destined to troublous times, for he had not been long in the colony ere a most vexatious hitch took place in the working of constitutional government. It arose out of a straggle with regard to what is called protection to native industry. The colony was filled with vigorous and enterprising men who had come to it for the purpose of digging for gold. For 4 or 5 years, gold digging had been on the average a fairly remunerative occupation. But when all the surface gold had been gathered, and it became necessary to dig shafts many hundreds of feet into the earth, and even then, in many cases, only to get quartz, from which the gold had to be extracted by crushing and careful washing, then the ordinary worker who had no command of capital had to take employment with the wealthier people who could afford to sink shafts and wait for years before the gold appeared. These men, therefore, had to take small wages for toiling at a most laborious occupation. But most of them had learnt trades of some sort in Europe, and the idea sprang up that if the colony prevented boots from coming into it from outside, there would be plenty of work for the bootmakers. If it stopped the importation of engines, there would no longer be any reason why engineers should work like navvies at the bottom of gold mines. They would be wanted to make the engines of the colony. After a long agitation, therefore, James McCulloch, the Premier of the colony, in 1864, brought a bill into the Victorian Legislative Assembly, according to which taxes were to be placed on all goods coming into the colony, if they were of a sort that might be made within the colony. McCulloch proposed to make this change because it was ardently desired by the working men of the colony, and these could, by their votes, control the action of the Legislative Assembly. But the upper house, called the Legislative Council, composed of wealthy men, who had been elected by the wealthier part of the community, thought, after careful decision, that any such plan would ruin the commerce of the colony without much benefiting its industries. They therefore rejected the proposed bill. McCulloch tried to persuade them to pass it, but they were obstinate. He then resorted to a trick which in itself objectionable, but which is perhaps excusable when the great body of the people wish a certain thing, and a small body, like the Legislative Council, are resolved to thwart them. It is part of our constitutional law that all bills dealing with money matters must be prepared in the lower house. The upper house can then accept them or reject them as they stand, but it is not allowed to alter them. Now, once a year Parliament has to pass a bill called the Appropriation Act, by which authority is given to the government to spend the public money in the various ways that Parliament directs. In 1865, McCulloch put the whole of the Protective Tariff Bill into the Appropriation Act as if it were a part of that act, though really it had nothing to do with it. The Legislative Assembly passed the Appropriation Act with this insertion. The Legislative Council now found itself in a most unlucky position. If it passed the Appropriation Act, it would also pass the Protective Tariff Bill, which it detested. But if it rejected the Appropriation Act, then the government would have no authority to pay away any money, and so all the officers of the state, the civil servants and the policemen, the teachers, the gaolers, the surveyors and the tide waiters would all have to go on for a year without any salaries. There was no middle course open, for the council could not alter the Appropriation Act and then pass it. Whether was it to pass the act and make the protective tariff the law of the land, or reject it, and run the risk of making a number of innocent people starve? It chose the latter alternative and threw out the bill. The whole country became immensely excited and seemed like one debating club, where men argued warmly either for or against the council. Matters were becoming serious when the ministry discovered an ingenious device for obtaining money. According to British law, if a man is unable to obtain from the government what it owes him, he sues for it in the Supreme Court, and then, if this court decides in his favour, it orders the money to be paid, quite independently of any Appropriation Act, out of the sums that may be lying in the Treasury. In their emergency, the ministry applied to the banks for a loan of money. 5 of them refused, but the 6th agreed to lend £40,000. With this, the government servants were paid, and then the bank demanded its money from the government, but the government had no authority from Parliament to pay any money, and could not legally pay it. The bank then brought its action at law. The Supreme Court gave its order, and the money was paid to the bank out of the Treasury. Thus, a means had been discovered of obtaining all the money that was required without asking the consent of Parliament. Throughout the year 1865, the salaries of officers were obtained in this way, but in 1866, the Upper House, seeing that it was being beaten, offered to hold a conference. Each house made concessions to the other, the tariff bill was passed, with some alterations. The appropriation bill was then agreed to in the ordinary way, and the deadlock came to an end. 3. The Darling Grant. But, in its train, other troubles followed, for the English authorities were displeased with Sir Charles Darling for allowing the government to act as it did. They showed how he might have prevented it, and, to mark their dissatisfaction, they recalled him in 1866. He bitterly complained of this harsh treatment, and the Assembly, regarding him as, in some measure, a martyr to the cause of the people, determined to recompense him for his loss of salary. In the Appropriation Act of 1867, they therefore passed a grant of £20,000 to Lady Darling, intending it for the use of her husband. The Upper House owed no debt of gratitude to Sir Charles, and accordingly it once more threw out the appropriation bill. Again there was the same bitter dispute, and again the public creditors were obliged to sue for their money in the Supreme Court. In a short time, 4,500 such pretended actions were laid, the government making no defence, and the order being given in each case that the money should be paid. In 1866, the new governor, Viscount Canterbury, arrived. But the struggle was still continued till, in 1868, Sir Charles Darling informed McCulloch that Lady Darling would decline to receive the money, as he was receiving instead £5,000 as arrears of salary and a lucrative position in England. The Upper House then passed the Appropriation Bill, and the contest came to an end. 4. Payment of members. But they had other things to quarrel about. The working men of the colony thought that they never would get fair treatment in regards to the laws until working men themselves in Parliament. But that could not be, so long as they had to leave their trades and spend their time in making laws while getting nothing for it. Hence they were resolved on having all members of Parliament paid, and they elected persons to the lower house who were in favour of that principle. But the better off people sent persons into the upper house who were against it. Thus for 20 years a struggle took place, but in the end the working men carried their point, and it was settled that every member of Parliament should receive £300 a year. The two houses also quarrelled about the manner in which the land was to be sold, the lower house being anxious to put it into the hands of industrious people who were likely to work on it as farmers, even though they could pay very little for it. The upper house preferring that it should be sold to the people who offered the most money for it. On this and other questions in dispute, the lower house gained the victory. 5. Exhibitions. It was not till the year 1880 that all these contentions were set at rest, but from that time the colony passed into a period of peace, during which it made the most astonishing progress in all directions. That progress was indicated in a most decided way by the exhibitions held in the colony. It had from time to time in previous years held intercolonial exhibitions, at which all the colonies had met in friendly competition. But in 1880, and again in 1888, Victoria invited all the world to exhibit their products at her show. A magnificent building was erected in one of the parks of Melbourne, and behind it were placed acres of temporary wooden erections, and the whole was filled with 20 acres of exhibits. A similar show, held in 1888, was much larger, and helped by its fine collection of pictures, its grand displays of machinery, its educational courts, its fine orchestral music, and so on, in 100 ways to stimulate and develop the minds of the people. During recent years, Victoria has been very busy in social legislation. While enjoying peace under the direction of a coalition government, with Mr. Duncan Gillies and Mr. Alfred Deakin at its head, the colony has tried experiments in regulating the liquor traffic, in closing shops at an early hour, in irrigating the waterless plains of the northwest, and in educating farmers and others into the most approved methods of managing their businesses. What is to be the eventual result, no one can as yet very definitely prophesy, but the eyes of many thoughtful persons throughout the world are at present turned to Victoria to see how those schemes are working which have been so zealously undertaken for the good of the people. Up till 1890, the progress of the colony was astonishing. Its central half forms a network of railways. Its agriculture and its trades have doubled themselves every few years, and though a period of restless activity and progress was in 1890 followed by a time of severe depression, the community, like all the other Australian colonies, has great times of prosperity in store for it. End of section 22. Recording by Katie Francesca.
Section 23 of History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in October 2019. History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890 by Alexander and George Sutherland. The Times of the Maoris, Part 1. 1. The Maoris. So far as we know, the original inhabitants of New Zealand were a dark-skinned race called Maoris, a people lithe and handsome of body, though generally plain of features, open, frank, and happy in youth, grave and often melancholy in their older years. They numbered 40,000 in the North Island, where the warmth of the climate suited them, but in the South Island there were only 2,000. They were divided into tribes who fought fiercely with one another, cooked and ate the bodies of the slain, and carried off the vanquished to be slaves. They dwelt in houses sometimes neatly built of wooden slabs, more often of upright poles with broad grass leaves woven between them. The roofs were of glass, pleated and thatched. To these abodes the entrances were only some 2 or 3 feet high, and, after crawling through, the visitor who entered at night would see the master of the house, his wives, his children, his slaves, indeed all his household, to the number of 20 or 30, lying on mats in rows down either side, with their heads to the walls and their feet to the center, leaving a path down the middle. In these rooms they slept, with a fire burning all night, till, what with the smoke and the breaths of so many people, the place was stifling. The roofs were only 4 feet higher than the ground outside, but then, inside, the earth was hollowed a foot or 2 to make the floor so that a man could just stand upright. These houses were gathered in little villages, often pleasantly situated beside a stream or on the seashore, but sometimes for defense they were placed on a hill and surrounded by high fences with ditches and earthen walls, so as to make a great stronghold of the kind they called a pa. The trenches were sometimes 20 or 30 feet deep, but generally the pa was built so that a rapid river or high precipices would defend 2 or 3 sides of it, while only the sides not so guarded by nature were secured by ditches and a double row of palisades. Within these enclosures, stages were erected behind the palisades, so that the fighting men could hurl stones and spears and defy an attacking party. 2. Maori customs. Round their villages and pas they dug up the soil and planted the sweet potato and the taro, which is the root of a kind of arum lily. They also grew the gourd called calabash, from whose hard rind they made pots and bowls and dishes. When the crops of sweet potato and taro were over, they went out into the forest and gathered the roots of certain sorts of ferns, which they dried and kept for their winter food. They netted fish and eels, they caught sharks with hook and line, and dried their flesh in the sun. To enjoy these meals in comfort, they had a broad veranda round their houses, which formed an open and generally pleasant dining room, where they gathered in family circles bound by much affection for one another. The girls especially were sweet and pretty. Their mild manners, their soft and musical voices, the long lashes of their drooping eyes, with the gloss of their olive-tinted skins, made them perfect types of dusky beauty. Grown a little older, they were by no means so attractive, and then, when married, they deeply scored their faces by the process of tattooing. Their men had their faces, hips, and thighs tattooed, that is, all carved in wavy lines which were arranged in intricate patterns. The women tattooed only their lips, chins, and eyelids, but often smeared their faces with red ochre and soaked their hair with oil. Men and women wore round the waist a kilt of beautifully woven flax, and over the shoulders a mat of the same material. They were expert sailors, and built themselves large canoes which 30 or 40 men would drive forward, keeping time with their paddles. Their large war canoes were 60 and 70 feet long, and would carry 100 men. Thus they were by no means uncivilized, but their condition was in some respects most barbarous. In person they were dirty, and in manners proud and arrogant. They were easily offended, and never forgave what they considered as an injury or insult. This readiness to take offense and to avenge themselves caused the neighboring tribes to be forever at war. They fought with great bravery, slaughtered each other fiercely, and ate the bodies. Sometimes they killed their captives or slaves in order to hold a cannibal feast. According to their own traditions, they had not been always in these islands. Their ancestors came from afar, and each tribe had its own legendary account. But they all agreed that they came from an island away to the north in the Pacific, which they called Availle, and there is little doubt but that some hundreds of years ago their forefathers must in truth have emigrated from some of the South Sea Islands. Whether they found natives on the islands and killed them all, we cannot now discover. There are no traces of any earlier people, but the Maoris in their traditions say that people were found on the islands and slain and eaten by the invaders. One tribe declared that long ago in far-off Availle a chief hated another, but was too weak to do him harm. He fitted out a canoe for a long voyage and suddenly murdered the son of his enemy. He then escaped on board the canoe with his followers and sailed away forever from his home. This legend declared how after many adventures he at length reached New Zealand. Another legend relates that in Availle the people were fighting, and the tribe being beaten was forced to leave the island. Sorrowfully it embarked in 2 canoes and sailed away out upon the tossing ocean, till, directed by the voice of their god sounding from the depths below them, they landed on the shores of New Zealand. How many centuries they lived and multiplied there it is impossible to say, as they had no means of writing and recording their history. 3. Tasman. The earliest we know of them for certain is in the Journal of Tasman, who writes under the date of 13th December 1642 that he had that day seen shores never before beheld by white men. He was then holding eastward after his visit to Tasmania, and the shore he saw was the mountainous land in the North Island. He rounded what we now call Cape Farewell, and anchored in a fine bay, whose green and pleasant shores were backed by high snow-capped mountains. Several canoes came off from the beach filled by Maoris, who lay about a stone's throw distant and sounded their war trumpets. The Dutch replied by a flourish of their horns. For several days the Maoris would come no nearer, but on the 6th they paddled out with 7 canoes and surrounded both vessels. Tasman noticed that they were crowding in a somewhat threatening manner round one of his ships, the Heemskerk, and he sent a small boat with 7 men to warn the captain to be on his guard. When the Maoris saw these 7 men without weapons sailing past their canoes, they fell on them, instantly killed 3 and began to drag away their bodies, no doubt to be eaten. The other 4 Dutchmen, by diving and swimming, escaped and reached the ship half dead with fright. Then with shouts the whole line of Maori canoes advanced to attack the ships, but a broadside startled them. They were stupefied for a moment at the flash and roar of the cannon and the crash of the woodwork of their canoes. Then they turned and fled, carrying with them, however, one of the bodies. Tasman sailed down into Cook Strait, which he very naturally took to be a bay, the weather being too thick for him to see the passage to the southeast. He then returned and coasted northwards to the extreme point of New Zealand, which he called Cape Maria van Diemen, probably after the wife of that governor of Batavia who had sent out the expedition. Tasman called the lands he had thus discovered New Zealand, after that province of Holland which is called Zeeland or the Sealand. The bay in which he had anchored was called Murderers or Massacre Bay. 4. Captain Cook. For more than 100 years New Zealand had no white men as visitors. It was in 1769 that Captain Cook, on his way home from Tahiti, steering to the southwest in the hope of discovering new lands, saw the distant hills of New Zealand. 2 days later he landed on the east coast of the North Island, a little north of Hawke Bay. There lay the little ship the Endeavour at anchor, with its bulging sides afloat on a quiet bay, in front a fertile but steeply sloping shore, with a pa on the crown of a hill, and a few neat little houses by the side of a rapid stream. In the evening, Cook, Banks, and other gentlemen took the pinnace and rowed up the streamlet. They landed, leaving some boys in charge of the boat, and advanced towards a crowd of Maoris, making friendly signs as they approached. The Maoris ran away, but some of them, seeing their chance, made a dash at the boys in the boat and tried to kill them. The boys pushed off and dropped down the stream. The Maoris chased them, determined on mischief. 4 of them being very murderous, the coxswain fired a musket over their heads. They were startled, but continued to strike at the boys with wooden spears. Seeing the danger, the coxswain levelled his musket and shot one of the Maoris dead on the spot. The others fled, and Cook, hearing the report of the gun, hurried back and at once returned to the ship. Over and over again Cook did everything he could devise to secure the friendship of these people, but they always seemed to have only one desire, and that was to kill and eat the white visitors. One day 5 canoes came out to chase the Endeavour as she was sailing along the coast. Another time 9 canoes densely filled with men sailed after her, paddling with all their might to board the vessel. In these and many other cases cannon had to be fired over their heads to frighten them before they would desist from their attempt to capture the ship. At one bay the Maoris made friends and went on board the Endeavour to sell provisions, but when all was going forward peaceably, they suddenly seized a boy and pulled him into their canoe. They were paddling away with him when some musket shots frightened them, and in the confusion the boy dived and swam back. Cook sailed completely round the North Island, charting the shores with great care, often landing, sometimes finding tribes who made friends, more often finding tribes whose insolence or treachery led to the necessity of firing upon them with small shot. If he had only known the customs of these people, he would have understood that to be friendly with one tribe meant that the next tribe would murder and eat them for revenge. He then sailed round the South Island, landing less frequently, however, till at length he took his leave of New Zealand at what he called Cape Farewell, and sailed away to Australia. He had been nearly 6 months exploring the coasts of these islands, and that in a very small vessel. During his time he had left pigs and goats, fowls and geese to increase in the forests, where they soon multiplied, especially the pigs. Potatoes and turnips were left with many tribes, who quickly learned how to grow them, so that after 10 or 12 years had passed away, these vegetables became the chief food of all the Maoris. 5. French visitors. Whilst Cook was sailing round the North Island, a French vessel anchored in a bay of that island in search of fresh water. The Ngapuhi tribe received them with pleasure and gave them all the assistance in their power, but some of them stole a boat. The captain, named de Surville, then seized one of the chiefs and put him in irons. The boat not being given up, he burnt a village and sailed to South America, the chief dying on the road. 3 years later, in 1772, came another Frenchman, Marion Dufresne, with 2 ships, this time for the express purpose of making discoveries. He sailed up the west coast, rounded the North Cape, and anchored in the Bay of Islands. He landed and made friends with the Ngampuhi tribe and took his 6 sailors ashore. The Maoris brought him plenty of fish, and Dufresne made them presents in return. For a month the most pleasant relations continued, the Maoris often sleeping on board, and the French officers spending the night in the Maori houses. One day Captain Marion went ashore with 16 others to enjoy some fishing. At night they did not return. Captain Crozet, who was second in command, thought they had chosen to sleep ashore, but the next day he sent a boat with 12 men to find where they were. These men were scattering carelessly through the woods when suddenly a dense crowd of Maoris, who had concealed themselves, attacked and killed all the Frenchmen but one. He who escaped was hidden behind some bushes, and he saw his comrades brained one after another. Then he saw the fierce savages cut their bodies in pieces and carry them away in baskets to be eaten. When the Maoris were gone, he crept along the shore and swam to the ship, which he reached half dead with terror. Crozet landed 60 men, and the natives gathered for a fight, but the Frenchmen merely fired volley after volley into a solid mass of Maori warriors, who, stupefied at the flash and roar, were simply slaughtered as they stood. Crozet burned both the Maori villages and sailed away. In later times the Maoris explained that the French had desecrated their religious places by taking the carved ornaments out of them for firewood. 6. Cook's later visits. In his second voyage, Cook twice visited New Zealand in 1773 and 1774. He had 2 vessels, one of them under the command of Captain Fourneau. While his later vessel was waiting in Queen Charlotte Sound, a bay opening out of Cook Strait, Captain Fourneau sent a boat with 9 men who were to go on shore and gather green stuff for food. A crowd of Maoris surrounded them, and one offered to sell a stone hatchet to a sailor, who took it, but to tease the native, in silly sailor fashion, this sailor would neither give anything for it nor hand it back. The Maori in a rage seized some bread and fish which the sailors were spreading for their lunch. The sailors closed to prevent their touching the victuals. A confused struggle took place, during which the English fired and killed 2 natives, but before they could load again they were all knocked on the head with the green stone axes of the Maoris. An officer sent ashore later on with a strong force found several baskets of human limbs, and in one of them a head, which he recognized as that of a sailor belonging to the party. The officer attacked some hundreds of the Maoris as they were seated at their cannibal feast, and drove them away from the half-gnawed bones. Cook again touched at New Zealand in the course of his 3rd voyage, and this time succeeded in maintaining friendly relations with the Maoris during a short visit. But when the story of Cook's voyage was published in later years, the people of Europe conceived a deep horror of these fierce man-eating savages. 7. The whalers. For 10 or 12 years New Zealand was not visited by white men, but the foundation of a town at Sydney, in 1788, brought ships out much more often into these waters, and before long it was found that the seas round New Zealand were well stocked with whales. Vessels came out to carry on the profitable business of catching them and taking their oil to Europe. For fresh water and for fuel for their stoves they called at the shores of New Zealand, chiefly at Queen Charlotte Sound, at Dusky Bay on the west coast of South Island, but especially at the Bay of Islands near the extreme north of North Island. There they not only got fresh water, but bought fish and pork and potatoes from the friendly tribes of natives, paying for them with knives and blankets, and although quarrels sometimes occurred and deaths took place on both sides, the whalers continued more and more to frequent these places. Sometimes the sailors, attracted by the good looks of the Maori girls, took them as wives and lived in New Zealand. These men generally acted as sealers. They caught the seals that abounded on some parts of the coast and gathered their skins until the ships called back, when the captain would give them tobacco and rum, guns and powder in exchange for their sealskins. These the sealers generally shared with the Maoris, who therefore began to find out that it was good to have a white man to be dwelling near them. He brought ships to trade, and the ships brought articles that the Maoris began to value. End of section 23. Section 24 of History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in October 2019. History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890. By Alexander and George Sutherland. The Times of the Maoris, Part 2. 8. Maoris visit Sydney. In 1793, Governor Hunter at Sydney directed that the convicts of Norfolk Island should be set to weave the fine flax that grew wild in that island. They tried, but could make no cloth so fine and soft as that made by the Maoris out of very much the same sort of plant. A ship was sent to try and persuade some Maoris to come over and teach the art. The captain of the ship, being lazy or impatient, did not trouble to persuade. He seized 2 Maoris and carried them off. They were kept for 6 months at Norfolk Island, but Captain King treated them very well and sent them back with 10 sows, 2 boars, a supply of maize seed, and other good things to pay them for their time. When King became governor of New South Wales, he sent further presents over to Te Pehi, chief of the tribe to which these young men belonged, and hence Te Pehi longed to see the sender of these things. He and his 4 sons ventured to go in an English vessel to Sydney, where they were astonished at all they saw. On his return, Te Pehi induced a sailor named George Bruce, who had been kind to him when he was sick on board ship, to settle in the tribe. The young Englishman married Te Pehi's most charming daughter, and was tattooed, and became the first of the Pakeha Maoris, or white men who lived in Maori fashion. Pleased by Te Pehi's account of what he had seen, other Maoris took occasional trips to Sydney, working their passages in whaling ships. 9. Friendly relations. Meanwhile, English vessels more and more frequently visited New Zealand for pork and flax and kauri pine, or else to catch seals, or merely to take a rest after a long whaling trip. The Bay of Islands became the chief anchorage for that purpose, and thither the Maoris gathered to profit by the trade. Some of the more adventurous, when they found that the English did them no harm, shipped as sailors for a voyage on board the whalers, but though they made good seamen, they were sometimes sulky and revengeful, and rarely continued at it more than 2 or 3 years. In 1805, a Maori went with an English surgeon all the way to England, and returned with the most astounding tales of London and English wonders. During the next 4 or 5 years, several other Maoris went to England, while, on the other hand, a very few respectable white men began to settle down in New Zealand. They were far superior to the rough sailors and liberated convicts of Sydney, who so far had been the most frequent visitors, so that mutual goodwill seemed to be established, as the Maoris found that there was much they could gain by the visits of the white men. But all this friendliness was marred by an unfortunate occurrence. 10. The Boyd Massacre. In 1809, a ship named the Boyd sailed from Sydney to go to England round Cape Horn. She had on board 70 white people, including some children of officers at Sydney who were on their way to England to be educated. As she was to call at New Zealand to get some kauri spars, 5 Maoris went with her, working their passage over. One of these Maoris, named Tara, was directed during the voyage to do something which he refused to do. The captain caused him to be twice flogged. When the ship anchored in a bay a little to the north of the Bay of Islands, Tara went ashore and showed to his tribe his back all scarred with the lash. Revenge was agreed on. The captain was enticed ashore with a few men, and they were suddenly attacked and all killed. Then the Maoris quietly got alongside the ship, rushed on board, and commenced the work of massacre among men, women, and children, who were all unarmed. Some of the children fell and clasped the feet of Tara, begging him to save them, but the young savage brained them without mercy. All were slain except a woman and 2 children who hid themselves during the heat of the massacre, and a boy who was spared because he had been kind to Tara. All the bodies were taken ashore and eaten. One of the chiefs, while curiously examining a barrel of gunpowder, caused it to explode, blowing himself and a dozen others to pieces. Tepehi, the head chief of the Ngapuhi, was extremely vexed when he heard of this occurrence, and took some trouble to rescue the 4 survivors, but 5 whaling vessels gathered for revenge. They landed their crews, who shot 30 Maoris, whether belonging to Tara's tribe or not, and in their blind fury burned Tepehi's village, severely wounding the chief himself. This outrage stopped all friendly intercourse for a long time. The whalers shot the Maoris whenever they saw them, about 100 being killed in the next 3 years, while the Maoris killed and ate any white people they could catch. Thus, in 1816, the Agnes, an American brig, happened to be wrecked on their shores. They killed and ate everybody on board, except one man, who was tattooed and kept for a slave during 12 years. 11. The missionaries. In spite of all these atrocities, a band of missionaries had the courage to settle in New Zealand and begin the work of civilizing these Maori tribes. This enterprise was the work of a notable man named Samuel Marsden, who had in early life been a blacksmith in England, but had devoted himself with rare energy to the laborious task of passing the examinations needed to make him a clergyman. He was sent out to be the chaplain to the convicts at Sydney, and his zeal, his faith in the work he had to do, and his roughly eloquent style made him successful where more cultured clergymen would have failed. For 14 years he toiled to reform convicts, soldiers, and officers in Sydney, and when Governor King went home to England in 1807, after his term was expired, Marsden went with him on a visit to his friends. While in London, Marsden brought before the Mission Society the question of doing something to Christianize these fierce but intelligent people, and the Society not only agreed, but employed 2 missionaries named Hall and King to undertake the work. When Marsden, along with these courageous men, started back to Sydney in the Anne convict ship in 1809, there was on board, strangely enough, a Maori chief called Ruatara. This young fellow was a nephew of Hongi, the powerful head chief of the Ngapuhi tribe. 4 years before, being anxious to see something of the wonders of civilized life, he had shipped as a sailor on board a whaler. He had twice been to Sydney and had voyaged up and down all the Pacific. At length, in 1809, he had gone to London, where he was lost in surprise at all he saw. The climate, however, tried him severely, and he was sick and miserable on the voyage back to Sydney. Marsden was kind to him and gave him a home in his own house. Ruatara had many troubles and dangers to meet through many months before he was at last settled among his own people. Meanwhile, the new governor of Sydney refused to allow the missionaries to go to New Zealand. The massacre of the 66 people of the Boyd had roused a feeling of horror, and it seemed a wicked waste of life to try to live among savages so fierce. The missionaries were therefore employed in Sydney. In 1813, Governor Macquarie directed that every vessel leaving for New Zealand should give bonds to the extent of £1,000 to guarantee that the white men should not carry off the natives or interfere with their sacred places. Then the trouble between the two races quieted down a little, and in 1814 the missionaries thought they might at least make further inquiries. A brig called the Active of 100 tons was bought, and on board it went Hall with another missionary called Kendall, grandfather of the poet, who had lately come out. They reached the Bay of Islands, taking with them abundance of presents. They saw Ruatara and persuaded him with his uncle, Hongi, and other chiefs to go to Sydney in the Active, and there discuss the question of a mission station. They went, and Hongi guaranteed the protection of his tribe, the Ngapuhi, if the missionaries would settle in their territory. 12. The mission station. It was in November 1814 that the Active sailed with the mission colony, consisting of Kendall, King, and Hall, their wives and 5 children, and a number of mechanics, in all 25 Europeans, together with 8 Maoris. They took 3 horses, a bull, 2 cows, and other livestock, and after a quick passage anchored near the north of the North Island. Marsden was with them as a visitor to see the place fairly started. He was troubled on landing to find that the Ngapuhi were at war with their near neighbors, the Wangaroans, and he saw that little progress would be made till these tribes were reconciled. Marsden fearlessly entered with only 1 companion into the heart of the hostile tribe, met Tara, the instigator of the Boyd massacre, and slept that night in the very midst of the Wangaroans. Wrapped up in his great coat, he lay close by Tara, surrounded by the sleeping forms of men and women, who, only a few years before, had gathered to the horrid feast. Surprised at this friendly trust, the Wangaroans were fascinated, and subsequently were led by him like children. They were soon induced to rub noses with the chiefs of Ngapuhi as a sign of reconciliation, and were then all invited on board the Active, where a merry breakfast brought old enemies together in friendly intercourse. The missionaries with 12 axes bought 200 acres of land on the shore of the Bay of Islands. Half an acre was soon enclosed by a fence, a few rough houses were built and a pole set up, upon which floated a white flag with a cross and a dove and the words, "Good Tidings." Ruatara made a pulpit out of an old canoe, covered it with cloth, and put seats round it. There, on Christmas Day 1814, Marsden preached the first sermon in New Zealand to a crowded Maori audience, who understood not 1 word of what was said, but who, perhaps, were benefited by the general impressiveness of the scene. In the following February, Marsden returned to Sydney, thinking the mission in a fair way of success. But all was not to be so harmonious as he dreamt. The liberated convicts, who formed the bulk of the crews of sealing and whaling vessels, treated the natives with coarseness and arrogance. The Maoris were quick to revenge themselves, and the murders, thefts, and quarrels along all the shore did more harm than the handful of missionaries could do good. 3 or 4 times they wished to leave, and as often did Marsden return and persuade them to stay. Their lives at least were safe, for Hongi, the Ngapuhi chief, found that they were useful in the way of bringing trade about, but he was dissatisfied because they would not allow guns and powder to be sold by the white men to him and his people. 13. Tribal Wars. Hongi saw that the tribe which possessed most guns was sure to get the upper hand of all the others. He therefore contrived in another way to secure these wonderful weapons. For in 1820, when Kendall went home to England for a trip, Hongi went with him and saw with constant wonder the marvels of the great city. The sight of the fine English regiments, the arsenals, the theatres, the big elephant at Exeter Change Menagerie, All impressed deeply the Maori from New Zealand forests. He stayed for a while at Cambridge, assisting a professor to compile a dictionary of the Maori language, and going to church regularly all the time. Then he had an audience from George IV, who gave him many presents, and among others a complete suit of ancient armor. For a whole season, Hongi was a sort of lion among London society. People crowded to see a chief who had eaten dozens of men, and so many presents were given him that when he came back to Sydney he was a rich man. He sold everything, however, except his suit of armor, and with the money he bought 300 muskets and plenty of powder, which he took with him to New Zealand. Having reached his home, he informed his tribe of the career of conquest he proposed. With these muskets he was going to destroy every enemy. "There is but one king in England," he said. "There shall be only one among the Maoris." He soon had a force of 1,000 warriors, whom he embarked on board a fleet of canoes, and took to the southern shores of the Hauraki Gulf, where the Ngatimaru lived, ancient enemies of the Ngapuhi, who, however, felt secure in their numbers and in the strength of their great Pa Totara. But Hongi captured the Pa and slew 500 of the unfortunate inmates. The Ngatimaru tribe then retreated south into the valley of the Waikato River and summoned their men and all their friends. A total of over 3,000 were arrayed on that fatal battlefield. Hongi, with his muskets, gained a complete victory. He shot the hostile chief with his own gun, and tearing out his eyes, swallowed them on the field of battle. Over 1,000 were killed, and Hongi and his men feasted on the spot for some days till 300 bodies had been eaten. The victors then returned, bearing in their canoes another 1,000 captives, of whom many were slain and cooked to provide a share of the horrid feast to the women of the tribe. In his bloodthirsty wars, Hongi showed great skill and energy. During the 2 following years he defeated, slaughtered, and ate large numbers of the surrounding tribes, and when the number of these unfortunate people withdrew to a Pa of enormous strength, nearly surrounded by a bend of the Waikato River, he dragged his canoes over to that river, ascended it, dashed at the steep cliffs, the ditches and palisades, and once more the muskets won the day. 1,000 fell in the fight. Then the women and children were slaughtered in heaps. The strong tribe of the Araba further south had their chief Pa on an island in the middle of Lake Rotorua. Hongi with great labor carried his canoes over to the lake. The spear-armed Maoris could do nothing in defense while he shot at them from the lake, and when he assaulted the island, though they came down to the water's edge to repel him, again there was victory for the muskets. Thus did Hongi conquer till the whole North Island owned his ascendancy. But in 1827 his career came to an end, for having quarreled with his former friends, the tribe of which Tara was chief, he killed them all but 20, but in the fight was himself shot through the lungs, for that tribe had now many muskets also, and a ball fired when the massacre was nearly over passed through Hongi's chest, leaving a hole which, though temporarily healed, caused his death a few months later. Pomare succeeded him as chief of the Ngapuhi and made that tribe still the terror of the island. At one Pa, Pomare killed 400 men, and he had his own way for a time in all his fights. But the other tribes now began to see that they could not possibly save themselves except by getting muskets also, and as they offered 10 times their value for them in pork and flax and other produce, English vessels brought them over in plenty. The remnant of the Waikato tribe having become well armed and well exercised in shooting under Te Wero Wero, they laid an ambush for Pomare and killed him with almost the whole of the 500 men who were with him. The other tribes joined Te Wero Wero and in successive battles ruined the Ngapuhi. Te Wero Wero held the leadership for a time, during which he almost exterminated the Taranaki tribe. He was practically lord of all the North Island till he met his match in Rauparaha, the most determined and wily of all the Maori leaders. He was the chief of a tribe living in the south of the North Island, and he gathered a wild fighting band out of the ruined tribes of his own and the surrounding districts. Many battles were fought between him and Te Wero Wero, in which sometimes as many as 1,000 muskets were in use on each side. Rauparaha was at length overcome, and with difficulty escaped across the strait to the South Island, while Te Wero Wero massacred and enslaved all over the North Island, cooking as many as 200 bodies after a single fight. And yet the evil was in a way its own cure, for, through strenuous endeavors, by this time every tribe had a certain proportion of its men well armed with muskets, and thus no single tribe ever afterwards got the same cruel ascendancy that was obtained first by the Ngapuhi and then by the Waikato tribe. But fights and ambushes, slaughters, the eating of prisoners, and all the horrid scenes of Maori war went on from week to week all over the North Island. End of section 24.
Section 25 of History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890 by Alexander and George Sutherland. New Zealand Colonised, Part 1. Section 1. Kororarika. All this fighting of the Maori tribes made them more dependent on the trade they had with white men. They could neither make guns nor powder for themselves, and the tribe that could purchase none of the white man's weapons was sure to be slaughtered and eaten by other tribes. Hence white men were more eagerly welcomed, and in course of time nearly 200 of them were living Maori fashion with the tribes. But it was at the Bay of Islands that the chief trading was carried on, for it was there that the kauri timber grew. It was there that the pigs were most plentiful and the cargoes of flax most easily obtained. And when a man named Turner set up a grog shop on the shores of the bay, all the whaling ships made this their usual place for resting and refitting. Behind the beach the hills rise steeply, and on these hills a number of white men built themselves homes, securely fenced and defended, sometimes even by a cannon or two. But down on the little green flat next to the beach, rude houses were more numerous. In the year 1838, there were about 500 persons resident in the little town, which was now called Kororarika. But at times there were nearly double that number of people resident in it for months together. A wild and reckless place it was, for sailors reckoned themselves there to be beyond the reach of English law. At one time as many as 36 ships lay off the town of Kororarika, and in a single year 150 ships visited the bay, generally staying a month or more at anchor. The little church and the Catholic mission station up on the hill did less good to the natives than these rough sailors did harm, and at length the more respectable white men could stand the disorder no longer. They formed an association to maintain decency. They seized, tried, fined, or sometimes locked up for a time the worst offenders, and twice they stripped the ruffians naked, gave them a coat of tar, stuck them all over with white down from a native plant, and when they were thus decorated, expelled them from the town, with a promise of the same treatment if they ever were seen back in it. 2. Hokianga. Long before this, the capacities of New Zealand and the chances of making wealth there became well known in England, and in 1825 an association was formed to colonize the country. It set out an agent who reported that Hokianga, a deep estuary on the west coast, just opposite to Kororareka and only 30 miles away from it, was a charming place for a settlement. The agent bought a square mile of land from the Maoris and also 2 little islands in the harbor. The company fitted out a ship, the Rosanna, and 60 colonists sailed out in her to form the pioneers of the new colony. They landed and liked the look of the place, but they were timid by reason of the tales they had heard of Maori ferocity. Now, at this time, the Gapuis were at war with the Araras, and the latter were getting up a war dance, which the settlers were just in time to see. 500 or 600 men stood in 4 long rows, stamping in time to a chant of their leader. It was night. A fire lit up their quivering limbs and their rolling eyes. They joined in a chorus, and when they came to particular words, they hissed like 1,000 serpents. They went through the performance of killing their enemies, cutting up their bodies and eating them. The settlers fell into deep meditation and departed. Not half a dozen remained in New Zealand. The others went to Sydney, and so, after an expense of £20,000, this association, which had been formed for the kindly purpose of putting people in lands less crowded than their own, failed and was disbanded. 3. Settled government. Between 1825 and 1835, the Maoris of the North Island were in a miserable state. Wars and massacres and cannibal feasts made the country wretched, and though the missionaries were respected, they could not secure peace. But they persuaded the chiefs of some of the weaker tribes to appeal to England for protection against the conquering warriors who oppressed and destroyed their people. It was in 1831 that this petition was sent to King William, and about the same time the white men at Kororareka, terrified at the violence with which the Waikato men were ravaging the surrounding lands, asked the governor at Sydney to interfere. The result was that although the English would not regularly take possession of New Zealand, they chose Mr. Busby, a gentleman well known in New South Wales, to be the resident there, his business being, so far as possible, to keep order. How he was to keep order without men or force to make his commands obeyed, it is hard to see, but he was expected to do whatever could be done by persuasion, and to send for a British warship if ever he thought it was needed. The first warship that thus came over did more harm than good. Its visit was caused by a disastrous wreck. The whaling bark Harriet, under the command of a man named Guard, a low fellow who had formerly been a convict, was trading among the islands when she was wrecked off the coast of Taranaki. The Maoris attacked the stranded ship, but the crew stayed on her and fired into the assailants, and it was not till after quite a siege, in which 12 seamen were killed, that the rest fled from the wreck, leaving Mrs. Guard and her 2 children in the hands of the Taranaki tribe. Guard and 12 seamen, however, though they escaped for a time, were caught by a neighboring tribe, to whom he promised a cask of gunpowder if they would help him to reach an English ship. This they did, and Guard reached Sydney, where he begged Sir Richard Bourke to send a vessel for the rescue of his wife and children. Bourke sent the Alligator with a company of soldiers, who landed and demanded the captive seamen. These were given up, but the captain of the ship supported Guard in breaking his promise, and refusing to give the powder, under the plea that it was a bad thing for natives. The Alligator then went round to Taranaki for the woman and children. The chief of the tribe came down to the beach and said they would be given up for a ransom. The white men seized him, dragged him into their boat to be a hostage, but he jumped out of the boat and was speared with bayonets. He was taken to the ship nearly dead. Then the natives gave up the woman and 1 child in return for their chief. After some parley, a native came down to the beach with the other child on his shoulders. He said he would give it up if a proper ransom was paid. The English said they would give no ransom, and when the man turned to go away again, they shot him through the back, quite dead. The child was recovered, but Mrs. Guard and the children testified that this native had been a good friend to them when in captivity. Nevertheless, his head was cut off and tumbled about on the beach. The Alligator then bombarded the native pa, destroyed all its houses to the number of 200, with all the provisions they contained, killed from 20 to 30 men in the process. This scarcely agreed with the letter which Mr. Busby had just received, in which he was directed to express to the Maori chiefs the regret which the King of England felt at the injuries committed by white men against Maoris. 4. Captain Hobson. But there were many difficulties in securing justice between fickle savages and white men, who were in general so ruffianly as those who then dwelt in New Zealand. The atrocities of the Harriet episode did some good, however, for along with other circumstances they stirred up the English government to make some inquiries into the manner in which Englishmen treated the natives of uncivilized countries. These inquiries showed much injustice and sometimes wanton cruelty, and when a petition came from the respectable people of Kororareka asking that some check should be put upon the license of the low white men who frequented that port, the English government resolved to annex New Zealand if the Maoris were willing to be received into the British Empire. For that purpose they chose Captain Hobson, a worthy and upright sea captain, who, in his ship of war, the Rattlesnake, had seen much of Australia and New Zealand. It was he who had taken Sir Richard Bourke to Port Phillip in 1837, and Hobson's Bay was named in his honor. After that he had been sent by Bourke to the Bay of Islands to inquire into the condition of things there, and when he had gone home to England he had given evidence as to the disorder which prevailed in New Zealand. He was sent in a war-ship, the Druid, with instructions to keep the white men in order, and to ask the natives if they would like to become subjects of Queen Victoria and live under her protection. If they agreed to do so, he was to form New Zealand into an English colony, and he was to be its lieutenant governor under the general control of the governor of New South Wales. Hobson reached Sydney at the end of 1839 and conferred with Governor Gipps, who helped him to draw up proclamations and regulations for the work to be done. On leaving Sydney, Hobson took with him a treasurer and a collector of customs for the new colony, a sergeant of police, and 4 mounted troopers of the New South Wales force, together with a police magistrate to try offenders, and 2 clerks to assist in the work of government. It was the 29th of January, 1840, when he landed at the Bay of Islands. Next day, on the beach, he read several proclamations, one of which asserted that all British subjects, even though resident in New Zealand, were still bound to obey British laws, and another declared that as white men were tricking the Maoris into selling vast tracts of land for goods of little value, all such bargains made after that date would be illegal, while all made before that date would be inquired into before being allowed. It was declared that if the Maoris in future wished to sell their land, the governor would buy it and pay a fair price for it. All white men who wished for land could then buy from the governor. 3 days later, the respectable white men of Kororareka waited on Captain Hobson to congratulate him on his arrival and to promise him their obedience and assistance. 5. Treaty of Waitangi. Meantime, Hobson had asked the missionaries to send word round to all the neighboring chiefs that he would like to see them, and on the 5th of February, 1840, a famous meeting took place on the shore of the Bay of Islands, near the mouth of the pretty river Waitangi. There, on a little platform on a chair of state, sat the new governor, with the officers of the ship in their uniform, and a guard of mariners and sailors, while beside the platform stood the leading white men of Kororareka. Flags fluttered all round the spot. At noon, when Hobson took his seat, there were over 500 Maoris, of whom 50 were chiefs, in front of the platform. Then one of the missionaries rose, and in the Maori tongue explained what the Queen of England proposed. First, that the Maoris, of their own accord, should allow their country to be joined to the British Empire. Second, that the Queen would protect them in their right to their land and all their property, and see that no white man interfered with them in it, but that if they chose to sell any of their land, then the governor would buy it from them. Third, that the Queen would extend to the Maoris, if they so desired, all the rights and privileges of British subjects, and the protection of British law. When these proposals had been fully explained, the Maoris were asked to say what they thought of them. 26 chiefs spoke in favor of accepting, and so bringing about peace and order in the land. 6 spoke against them, declaring that thus would the Maoris be made slaves. The natives seemed very undecided, when Wakanene arose and in an eloquent address showed the miseries of the land now that firearms had been introduced, and begged his countrymen to place themselves under the rule of a queen who was able and willing to make the country quiet and happy. The Maoris were greatly excited, and Hobson therefore gave them a day to think over the matter. There was much discussion all night long among the neighboring pas and villages, but the next day when the Maoris gathered, 46 chiefs put their marks to the parchment now always known as the Treaty of Waitangi. This treaty was taken by missionaries and officers from tribe to tribe, and in the course of 2 or 3 months over 500 chiefs had signed it. On the 21st of May, Hobson proclaimed that the islands of New Zealand were duly added to the British Empire, and that he would assume the rule of the new colony as lieutenant governor. Meantime, houses had been built at Koroarikia for the governor and his officers. A custom house had been set up, and taxes were levied on all goods landed, so as to provide a revenue with which to pay these and other government expenses. 6. Auckland. But the people at Koroariika had bought from the natives all the level land in the place, and thinking their town would soon be a great city and the capital of an important colony, they would not sell it except at very high prices. Now Captain Hobson had seen at the head of the Hauraki Gulf a place which seemed to him to be more suitable for the capital of the future colony. To this lovely spot he changed his residence. He bought from the natives about 30,000 acres, and on an arm of the Gulf, where the Waitemata harbor spreads its shining waters, he caused a town to be surveyed and streets to be laid out. In April 1841, after he had reserved sufficient land for government offices, parks, and other public purposes, he caused the rest to be offered in allotments for sale by auction. There was a general belief that now, when the islands were formally annexed to the British Empire, New Zealand would be a most prosperous colony, and that land in its capital would go up rapidly in value. Many speculators came over from Sydney. The bidding was brisk, and the allotments were sold at the rate of about £600 per acre. A few months later, a sale was held of lands in the suburbs and of farming lands a little way out from the town. This was again successful. Houses began to spring up, most of them slender in structure, but with a few of solid appearance. Next year ships arrived from England with 560 immigrants, who rapidly settled on the land, and before long a thriving colony was formed. The little town was very pretty, with green hills behind the branching harbor that lay in front, dotted with volcanic islets. The whole district was green, and the figures of Maoris in the grassy streets their canoes bringing in vegetables to market, their paws seen far off on the neighboring hills, gave the scene a charming touch of the romantic. A company of 6 soldiers with 4 officers came from Sydney to defend the settlers, and barracks were built for them. The name chosen for the city was Auckland, after a gentleman named Eden, who had taken for half a century a deep interest in colonizing experiments, and who had been raised to the peerage with the title of Lord Auckland. 7. New Zealand Company. Meantime, another part of New Zealand had been colonized under very different circumstances. The English Association, which in 1825 attempted to form a settlement at Hokianga and failed, had consisted of very influential men. They had not given up their plans altogether, and in 1837 they formed a new association called the New Zealand Company. That restless theorist Edward Gibbon Wakefield, who had already sent out the settlers who had just founded Adelaide, joined this association and impressed the members with their own ideas already described on page 67. It was arranged that a colony should be sent out to New Zealand on the plan of a complete little community. There were to be gentlemen and clergymen and teachers, so many farmers, so many carpenters, so many blacksmiths. Every trade was to be represented, so that everybody would have something to do, and there would be none too many of any one kind. A bill was brought before Parliament for the purpose of establishing a colony after this fashion, and at first Parliament was inclined to favour the bill, but the missionaries in New Zealand were hostile to the proposal. They were steadily converting the Maoris to Christianity. They hoped to turn them into quiet, industrious, and prosperous people, if white men did not come and take away their land from them. Parliament, therefore, refused to pass the bill, but the company had gone too far to retreat. It had already arranged with many settlers to take them and their families out to New Zealand, and had begun to sell land at so much an acre. Nobody knew where, except that it was to be in New Zealand. They therefore quietly purchased and fitted out a vessel named the Tory to go to New Zealand and make arrangements. The party was under the charge of Colonel Wakefield, brother of Edward Gibbon Wakefield, and he took with him surveyors to lay out the land, farming experts to judge of the soil, and a scientific man to report on the natural products. This vessel sailed away quietly in May 1839, hoping to reach New Zealand unnoticed. The English government heard of it, however, informed the company that its action was illegal, and immediately afterwards sent off Captain Hobson in the Druid, as has been already described, to take possession on behalf of the British nation. The New Zealand Company then apologized, said that they would direct their agents who had gone out to New Zealand to obey the governor in all things, and promised that the new settlement should abide by the law. End of section 25. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC.
Section 26 of History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Priscilla Sodeke. History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890 by Alexander and George Sutherland. New Zealand Colonised. Part 2. 8. Wellington. Meantime, the Tory was ploughing the deep on her way to New Zealand. Her passengers first saw the new country on the west coast of the South Island. They were then very much disappointed, for the shore was high and wild, the mountains were close behind it, and their lofty sides were gloomy and savage. The whole scene was grand, but did not promise much land that would be suitable for farming. They turned into Cook Strait and anchored in Queen Charlotte Sound, a lovely harbour, but surrounded by high hills, clothed in dark and heavy forests. When they landed, they were amazed at the depth and richness of the black soil and the immense size to which the trees grew. Such a soil could grow all sorts of produce in rich abundance, but it would cost £40 an acre to clear it for ploughing. Boats were got out, however, and parties rowed up into all the branches of the beautiful harbour, but without seeing any sufficient extent of level or open land. Then they crossed the strait and, sailing in by a narrow entrance, viewed all the wide expanse of Port Nicholson. It was a great harbour with a little wooded island in its middle. It opened out into quiet arms, all fringed with shelly beaches, and behind these rose range after range of majestic mountains. The trouble was that here too the land, which was fairly level, was too limited in extent to satisfy the colony's needs. For already in England the company had sold 100,000 acres of farming land, and the purchasers would soon be on their way to occupy it. After examining the shores with care, they chose the beach of the east side as the site for their town. Behind it stretched the beautiful valley of the Hutt River, enclosed by mountains, but with broad, grassy meadows lying between. Here they started to build a town, which they called Britannia, and they made friends with the Maoris of the district. A Pakeha Maori named Bennett acted as interpreter. The natives went on board the Tory, were shown 239 muskets, 300 blankets, 160 tomahawks and axes, 276 shirts, together with a quantity of looking-glasses, scissors, razors, jackets, pots, and scores of other things, with 81 kegs of gunpowder, 2 casks of cartridges, and more than a ton of tobacco. They were asked if they would sell all the land that could be seen from the ship in return for these things. They agreed, signed some papers, and took the goods on shore, where they at once began to use the muskets in a grand fight among themselves for the division of the property. It was soon discovered that the site of the town was too much exposed to westerly gales, and the majority of settlers crossed Port Nicholson to a narrow strip of grassy land between a pretty beach and some steep hills. Here was founded the town called Wellington, after the famous Duke. By this time the settlers were arriving thick and fast. The first came in the Aurora, which reached the settlement on 22nd January 1840. Other ships came at short intervals, till there were 12 at anchor in Port Nicholson. The settlers were pleased with the country. They landed in good spirits and set to work to make themselves houses. All was activity, surveyors, carpenters, bricklayers, blacksmiths, everyone busy, and rapidly a smart little town of some 100 houses rose behind the beach. The Maori came and helped in the work, getting 3 or 4 shillings a day for their services, and proving themselves very handy in many ways. All were in sanguine spirits when word came from Governor Hobbs at Auckland that, in accordance with his proclamation, all purchases of land from the natives were illegal, he having come to protect the Maoris from imposition. 9. The land question. Now Colonel Wakefield had fancied that he had bought 20 million acres for less than £9,000 worth of goods, and he was assigning it as fast as he could to people who had paid £1 an acre to the company in England. Here was a sad fix. The governor sent down his chief officer, Mr. Shortland, who rode across the island with the mounted police, and told the settlers not to fancy the land theirs, as he would ere long have to turn them off. Disputes arose, for it seemed absurd that 58 Maori chiefs should sell the land on which many thousands of people dwelt, the majority of these people never having so much as heard of the bargain. The settlers talked of starting for South America and forming a colony in Chile. But more kept on coming, so that they had not ships enough to take them across. And besides, they had paid £1 an acre to the company and demanded their land. Colonel Wakefield went off to Auckland to talk the matter over with Governor Hobbs, who left the difficulty to be settled by his superior, Governor Gipps, at Sydney. Wakefield then went to Sydney to see Governor Gipps, who said that the whole thing was irregular, but that he would allow the settlers to occupy the land, supposing that every Maori who had a proper claim to any part of it got due compensation, and if 20 acres of the central part of Wellington were reserved for public buildings. These conditions Wakefield agreed to, and, very glad to have got out of a serious difficulty, he returned with the good tidings. Shortly afterward, Governor Hobbs himself visited Wellington, but was very coldly received by the settlers there. In the next 2 years, 350 ships arrived at Wellington, bringing out over 4,000 settlers. Of these, about 1,000 went up into the valleys and made farms, but 3,000 stayed in and around Wellington, which then grew to be a substantial little town, with 4 good piers, about 200 houses of wood or brick, and about 250 houses of more slender construction. More than 200 Maoris could be seen in its streets, clad in the European clothes given as payment for the land. In all there were about 700 Maoris in the district, and for their use the company set apart 11,000 acres of farmlands and 110 acres in the town. Roads were being made into the fertile valleys, where 8 or 10,000 acres were occupied as farms being rapidly cleared and tilled. Parties were organized to go exploring across the mountains. They brought back word that inland the soil was splendid, sometimes covered with forests, sometimes with meadows of long grass or New Zealand flax, but always watered by beautiful rivers and under a lovely climate. The Maoris were everywhere friendly throughout their journey. 10. Taranaki. In the beginning of the year 1840, an emigration society had been formed in the southwest of England to enable the farm labourers and miners of Cornwall, Devon and Dorset to settle in less crowded lands. The Earl of Devon was its president and Plymouth its headquarters. They chose New Zealand for the site of their colony, and understanding that New Zealand Company had bought half of the North Island, they gave that company £10,000 for the right to select 60,000 acres of it. It was in March 1841 that the pioneers of this new colony arrived at Wellington under the guidance of Mr. Carrington, a surveyor in the ship William Bryant. The exploring party had just come back, and its report of the Taranaki land was very tempting. Immediately after receiving that report, Colonel Wakefield had gone off to purchase it. He found a few natives left there, the remnant of the tribes whom Te Huero had destroyed or carried into slavery. These few people had taken refuge up in the awful solitudes of the giant Mount Egmont, but had come back to dwell, a sorrow-stricken handful, in the homes of their fathers. Barrett was left to arrange a bargain with them, and in return for a quantity of goods they sold all the land along 60 miles of coast, with a depth of 15 miles inland. This was the land which Wakefield recommended for the new settlers, and he lent them a ship to take them round. There they landed, and in spite of their disappointment at the want of safe harbour, they set to work and built up their little town, which they called New Plymouth. In September of the same year, the main body of settlers arrived for this new colony and were landed at Taranaki, when they immediately scattered out over the country as fast as Carrington could survey it for them. But there was now a difficulty, for TriciaG and his tribe had released many hundreds of the Taranaki natives who had been carried off as slaves. Whether it was because they had now become Christians or because the slaves were more in number than they could use, it was not easy to determine. But at any rate, in that very month of September, when hundreds of white men were arriving to occupy the land, hundreds of Maoris were coming back to reoccupy it. They begged the settlers not to fell their big trees, but were very mild in their conduct. They chose places not yet claimed by the white men, and there fenced in the land on which to grow their sweet potatoes. Meanwhile, there was another complication. By Maori custom, a warrior had the ownership of the lands he conquered. Governor Hobbs therefore regarded TriciaG as the owner of the Taranaki land, and gave him £400 for his right to it. Hobbs declared that the Auckland government was the owner of this land, and that all settlers must buy it from him. Eventually the trouble was cleared up for the time being, when Hobson allowed the company to keep 10 miles of coast running back, 5 or 6 miles, the rest to belong to the government, which would set aside a certain part for the use of the Maoris. In December 1842, a settler claimed a piece of land which a Maori had fenced in. He pulled down the fence. The Maoris put it up again. The settler, assisted by an officer, pulled it down once more. A young chief who brandished a tomahawk and threatened mischief was arrested and carried into New Plymouth, where a magistrate liberated him and declared the action of the settler illegal. Matters for a time kept in this unfriendly state, ominously hinting the desperate war that was to follow. 11. Wanganui. Meanwhile, the settlers in the Wellington district were finding that by crossing difficult mountains they could get sufficient level land for their purpose, and at the close of 1840 200 of them sailed 150 miles north to where the river Wanganui falls into Cook Strait. The land was rich and the district beautiful. Colonel Wakefield supposed that he had bought the whole of it, though the natives afterwards proved that they sold only part on the north side of the river. Here, about 4 miles from the mouth of the stream, the settlers formed a little town which they called Petre, but which is now known as Wanganui. The natives were numerous on the river banks, their villages were frequent, and up on the hills that rose all around like an amphitheatre, the palisades of their fortified pas were easily visible. But the fine black soil of the district, in places grassy, in places with patches of fine timber, proved very attractive to the settlers, and soon there came 6 ships with more colonists, direct from England. The natives were friendly to the white men, and gave them a cordial welcome. Down the river came their canoes laden with pigs, potatoes, melons, and gourds, for sale in the market of the little town. It was all goodwill until the Maoris found that the white men had come not merely to settle among them, but to appropriate all the best of the land. Then their tempers grew sour, and the prospect steadily grew more unpleasant. 12. Neilson. The emigration spirit was at this time strong in England, for it was in the year 1840 to 1841 that free settlers chiefly colonized both Victoria and South Australia. New Zealand was as much a favourite as any, and when the New Zealand Company proposed in 1841 to form a new colony somewhere in that country to be called Neilson, nearly 100,000 acres were sold at 30 shillings an acre to men who did not know even in which island of New Zealand the land was to be situated. In April of the same year, the pioneers of the new settlement started in the ships Whitby and Will Watch, with about 80 settlers, their wives, families, and servants. Captain Arthur Wakefield was the leader, and he took the ships to Wellington, where they waited while he went out to search for a suitable site. He chose a place at the head of Tasman Bay, where in a green hollow fringed by beautiful beach and embosomed deep in majestic hills, the settlers soon gathered in the pretty little town of Neilson. The soil was black earth resting on great boulders, Out of it grew low bushes easily cleared away, and here and there stood a few clumps of trees to give a grateful shade. The place was shut in by the hills, so as to be completely sheltered from the boisterous gales of Cook Strait, and altogether it was a place of dreamy loveliness. Its possession was claimed by Rauparaha, the warrior, on the ground of conquest. With him and other chiefs the settlers had a conference, the result of which was that a certain specified area round the head of the bay was purchased, but the white men regarded themselves as having the right of superior beings to go where they wished and to do with the land what they wished. Finding a seam of good coal at a place outside their purchase, they did not in any way scruple to send a vessel to carry it off, in spite of the protests of the Maoris. 13. Death of Governor Hobson. These things hinted at troubles which were to come, but in 1842 all things looked promising for the colonies of New Zealand. There were altogether about 12,000 white persons, most of them being men who wore blue shirts and lived on pork and potatoes. Auckland, the capital, had 3,000, but Wellington was the largest town with 4,000 people. Next to that came Neilson, with 2,500. New Plymouth and Wanganui were much smaller, but yet thriving places. They had no less than 9 newspapers, most of them little primitive sheets, but wonderful in communities so young. In October 1841, Dr. George Selwyn was appointed to be Bishop of New Zealand, and he left England with a number of clergymen who settled in Auckland, Wellington, Neilson, and New Plymouth. Churches began to spring up, and schools, not only for white children but also for Maoris. An immense change for the better had appeared among the Maoris. The last case of cannibalism took place about this time, and though they still fought among one another, it was not with the same awful bloodshed that had characterized the previous 20 years. On the 16th November 1840, the Queen declared New Zealand an independent colony. Hobson was then no longer Lieutenant Governor merely, and subject to Governor at Sydney. He was Governor Hobson, and of equal rank with all the other governors. He now had a legislative council to assist him in making for New Zealand such laws as might be needed in her peculiar circumstances. In that council the Chief Justice, the Colonial Secretary, the Surveyor General, the Attorney General, and the Protector of the Maoris had seats. But Hobson did not long enjoy his new dignity. He had had a difficult task to perform, and his duty had led him into conflict with many people who had wished to purchase their land from the natives at ridiculous prices. In the midst of his worries, he had several strokes of paralysis, of which the last killed him in September 1842, and he was buried in the cemetery at Auckland. He had lived, however, to see New Zealand colonised, and had died, much liked by the Maoris, without seeing any of that bitter struggle between the two races, which was soon to shed so much blood and waste so much treasure. End of section 26. Recording by Priscilla Sodeke.
Section 27 of History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890 by Alexander and George Sutherland. Section 27. White Men and Maoris. 1. Governor Fitzroy. When Governor Hobson died, his place was taken by his friend Lieutenant Shortland until a new governor could be sent out. The English people were at this time very anxious to see that the natives of new lands which they colonised should be fairly treated, and for that purpose they chose Captain Fitzroy to be the new governor. Up to this time he had been the captain of a ship and had made himself famous in surveying and mapping little-known shores in his ship the Beagle, in which he had visited New Zealand on a trip round the world. and he was therefore called to give evidence as to its condition before the Committee of the House of Lords in 1838. He was well known to have shown much consideration to native tribes, and his strong wish to deal justly by them had often been shown. This was the main reason for his appointment. He landed in November 1843 and found the colony in a state of great depression, the public treasury being not only empty, but in debt. For many officials had been appointed, judges, magistrates, policemen, customs receivers, and so on, and to pay the salaries of these, everyone had relied on the continued sale of land. But in 1841 there had come out the first land commissioner, William Spain, who began to inquire into the disputes about land which had arisen between white men and Maoris. Out of every 10 acres the white men said they had bought, he allowed them to keep only 1. This was but fair to the Maoris, who had been induced very often to make most foolish bargains. But the settlers ceased to buy land when they were not certain of keeping it. Hence the land sales stopped. The governor owed £20,000 more than he could pay, and so he was confronted with troubles from his very first arrival. 2. Wairau Massacre. Just before he came, an incident had happened which deepened the trouble of the colony. At the north of the South Island, not far from Neilson, there was a fine valley watered by the stream Wairau, which Colonel Wakefield claimed, alleging that it was part of the land he had bought with the Neilson district. Rauparaha and his son-in-law, Rangihaita, claimed it by right of conquest, and they had a couple of 100 stout warriors at their back, all well armed with muskets. Mr. Spain sent word that he was coming to settle the dispute, but, in spite of that, Captain Wakefield sent surveyors to measure out the land for occupation by the settlers. The surveyors were turned off by Rauparaha, who carried their instruments and other property carefully off the land and then burned the huts they had put up. The Maoris did no violence and were courteous though determined. The surveyors returned to Neilson, and Captain Wakefield induced the local magistrates to issue a warrant for the arrest of Rauparaha and Rangihaita. To execute this warrant, Mr. Thompson, the police magistrate, himself went in a small vessel, and with him went Captain Wakefield, 7 other gentlemen, and 40 labourers, in all a party of 49, of whom 35 were armed with guns. When they landed at the mouth of the Wairau River, Piraha, a Christian native, met them and begged them not to go on, as Rauparaha was ready to fight, but they paid no attention, and after marching 8 miles up the pretty valley, they saw the Maoris, about 100 in number, standing behind the stream, which, though only waist deep, had a rushing current of chilly water. Rauparaha said, "Here I am. What do you want with me?" Mr. Thompson said he must go to Neilson, and an irritating conversation ensued. Rangihaita drew up his tall form, his curly black hair setting off a face of eagle sharpness, and from his eye there gleamed an angry light. Behind him stood his wife, the daughter of Rauparaha, and near them this latter chief himself, short and broad, but strong and wiry looking, a man with a cunning face, yet much dignity of manner. When the handcuffs were produced by Mr. Thompson, Rauparaha warned him not to be so foolish. The magistrates gave the order to fix bayonets and advance. As the white men were crossing the stream, a shot was fired by one of them. It struck dead the wife of Rangihaita. Thereupon the Maoris fired a volley, and the white men hesitated on the brink of the water. A second volley and a third told upon them with deadly effect, and the labourers, who carried arms, but had neither martial spirit nor experience, turned and fled. 5 of the gentlemen with 4 of the labourers stood their ground, and when the Maoris crossed, they surrendered. Rauparaha called out to spare them, but Rangihaita, mad at the loss of a wife he loved, brained them with his tomahawk one after another, while the young men hunted the labourers through the trees and slew such as they overtook. 27 white men reached the shore and were carried quickly in the boats to the brig, 5 of them badly wounded. 22 lay dead alongside of 5 natives whom the white men had slain. Raparaha feared the vengeance of the white man. He had few resources in the South Island, while the Neilson settlers could send 500 armed men against him. He crossed in his own war canoes over a stormy strait in wild weather. Weary and wet with spray, he landed in the south of the North Island, roused his countrymen by his fervid oratory, to which he gave a fine effect by jingling before them the handcuffs with which he was to have been led a prisoner to Neilson. A day or two after the massacre, a Wesleyan clergyman went out from Neilson to Wairau and reverently buried those ghastly bodies with the cloven skulls. Not one had been mangled, far less had there been any cannibalism. 3. Effects of Wairau massacre. The Maoris were clearly less ferocious than they had been, and more than half of them had become fervid Christians after a fashion. But in some respects they were getting their eyes opened. The missionaries had told them that the white men were coming for their benefit, yet now they began to see that the white men were soon to be the lords of the soil, and that the natives must sink back into the position of servants. If a white man visited a Maori village, he was received as a man of distinction and entertained. If a Maori chief went to a white man's town, he was allowed to wander in the street, or if at all accosted, it was with the condescension of a superior race to a race of servants. The Maori blood was firing up. The story of Wairau made them change their mind about the white man's courage. The whalers had been hearts of daring. These newcomers had run and bawled for their lives. The natives were anxious also as to the result which would happen when all the lands near the shore should have been occupied by white men, and they themselves hemmed up in the interior. A special interest was given to these feelings when, in 1844, Te Weru gave a great feast, only 2 miles out of Auckland, partly as a welcome to Governor Fitzroy, and partly as a demonstration in regard to the land question. He displayed a lavish bounty. 11,000 baskets of potatoes and 9,000 sharks, with great stores of other provisions, were distributed. But when the settlers saw a war dance of 1,600 men, all well armed with muskets and drilled with wonderful precision, they felt that their lives were at the mercy of the native tribes. Not 1/4 of that number of armed men, with any training for battle, could have been sent forth from the settlement for its own defence. This gave a significance to the Wairau massacre that created quite a panic. Fresh settlers ceased to come, many that were there already now left. Those who had taken up farms far out in the country abandoned them and withdrew to the towns. 4. Honi Heke. And yet the great majority of the Maoris seem to have had no unfriendly purpose. When Governor Fitzroy went down to see Raparaha, he had no more than 12 white men with him when he entered an assemblage of 500 Maoris. He said he had come to inquire about the sad quarrel at Wairau, and Raparaha told him his story, while others supported it by their evidence. Fitzroy stated that the Maoris had been very wrong to kill those who had surrendered, but as the white men had fired first, he would take no vengeance for their death. Indeed, at Wellington and Neilson, Fitzroy openly said that the magistrates were wholly misguided in trying to arrest the native chief, and at Neilson he rebuked all those who had been concerned in the affair. This gave great offence to the white men. They asked if the blood of their friends and relatives was thus to be shed and no sort of penalty to be exacted for the slaughter. Many of the magistrates resigned, and a deep feeling of irritation was shown towards the governor, some of the settlers petitioning the English government to recall him. In the August of 1844, a young chief, named Honi Heke, who dwelt at the Bay of Islands, on account of a private quarrel with a rough whaler, entered the town of Kororarika with a band of armed followers. He plundered a few shops and cut down a flagstaff on which the Union Jack floated from a steep hill behind the town. There were then not more than 90 soldiers in New Zealand, and when Heke threatened to burn Kororarika and do the same to Auckland, there was too good reason to fear that he might be as good as his word, for he had 200 well-armed men at his back, and a comrade of his, named Kawiti, had nearly as many. A chief named Wakanene, with his men, kept Heke in check, while Fitzroy sent to Sydney and received 160 soldiers with 2 cannon. These landed at the Bay of Islands, but Wakanene begged the governor not to hurry into hostilities. He arranged for a friendly meeting. Fitzroy met 9 principal chiefs, who apologised, and made Heke send also a written apology. Fitzroy said he would redress some wrongs the natives said they had suffered, and having obtained from Heke 10 muskets by way of fine, and having again set up the flagstaff, he returned to Auckland. But before the year was ended, Heke approached the town once more with 100 armed men. He insulted it from the hills, cut down the flagstaff again, and then withdrew to the forests. Fitzroy published a proclamation offering £100 for his capture, and Heke replied by offering £100 for the head of Fitzroy. The governor now caused a new flagstaff to be set up, all sheathed with iron at the bottom, and with a strong wooden house attached to it, in which a score of soldiers were always to keep guard. A blockhouse or small wooden fortress was set up at a little distance down the hill towards Kororarika. Nevertheless, Heke said he would come and cut down the flagstaff again. Then the inhabitants of Kororarika began to drill in order to give him a warm reception if he came. Lieutenant Philpott, the commander of the Hazard ship of war, came ashore to drill them and to mount 1 or 2 cannon. Yet Heke, lurking among the hills, contrived by a sudden dash to capture Lieutenant Philpott. However, after dealing courteously with him, he released him. 5. Kororarika burnt. On the 11th of March 1845, at daylight, Heke with 200 men crept up to the flagstaff, surprised the men in the house attached, and when 20 men came out of the lower blockhouse to help their friends on the top of the hill, he attacked them and drove them down into the town in the hollow beside the shore. Close to the beach was a little hill, and on the top of this hill stood a house with a garden surrounded by a high fence. Behind this, the soldiers and all the people of Kororarika took refuge. From the rocky high ground round about, the Maoris fired down upon them, while the white men fired back, and the guns of the Hazard, which had come close into the shore, kept up a constant roar. For 3 hours this lasted, 10 white men being killed, as well as a poor little child, while 34 of the natives were shot dead. The Maoris were preparing to retreat when, by some accident, the whole of the powder that the white men possessed was exploded. Then they had to save themselves. The women and children were carried out, boat after boat, to the 3 ships in the harbour. Then the men went off, and the Maoris, greatly surprised, crept cautiously down into the deserted town. They danced their war dance, sent off to their parents in the ships some white children who had been left behind, and then set fire to the town, destroying property to the value of £50,000. Heke's fame now spread among the Maoris. When the settlers from Kororarika were landed at Auckland, homeless, desperate, and haggard, a panic set in, and some settlers sold their houses and lands for a trifle and departed. Others with more spirit enrolled themselves as volunteers. 300 men were armed and drilled. Fortifications were thrown up round the town, and sentries posted on all the roads leading to it. At Wellington and Neilson also, men were drilled and stockades were built for defence. 6. First Maori War. But Herne Heike was afraid of the soldiers, and when Colonel Hume arrived from Sydney with several companies, he withdrew to a strong pa of his, 18 miles inland. Hume landed at the nearest point of the coast with a force of 400 men. These were joined by 400 friendly allies under Wakanene, whose wife led the tribe in a diabolic war dance, not a little startling to the British soldiers. The road that was to lead them to Hone Heike was only a track through a dense forest. Carts could not be taken, but each man carried biscuits for 5 days and 30 rounds of ammunition. Under 4 days of heavy rain, they trudged along in the dripping pathway, all their biscuits wet and much of their powder ruined. At last, on a little plain, between a lake and a wooded hill, they saw before them the pa of Hone Heike. 2 great rows of tree trunks stuck upright formed a palisade round it. They were more than a foot thick and 12 feet high, and they were so close that only a gun could be thrust between them. Behind these there was a ditch in which stood 250 Maoris, who could shoot through the palisades in security. The British slept that night without tents round fires of kauri gum, but next morning all was astir for the attack. A rocket was sent whizzing over the palisades. It fell and burst among the Maoris, frightening them greatly, but succeeding discharges were failures, and the Maoris gathered courage to such an extent that a number under Kawiti came out to fight. The soldiers lowered their bayonets and charged, driving them back into the pa. During the night, while the white men were smoking round their fires, the sound of the plaintive evening hymn rising in the still air from the pa suggested how strong was the hold that the new faith now had on the Maori mind. Next day, Colonel Hume, seeing that a place defended on all sides by such a strong palisade could not be captured without artillery, dug the graves of the 14 soldiers killed, and marched back, carrying with him 39 wounded men. There was dismay in Auckland when this news arrived. What could be said when 400 English soldiers retreated from 250 savages? But, on the other hand, the Maoris had learned a lesson. They could not fight against English bayonets in the open, but while taking aim from behind palisades, they were safe. Therefore, they began in different places to strengthen their fortresses, and Hone Heike added new defences to his power of Auhiawai, which stood in the forest 19 miles from the coast. 7. Auhiawai. More soldiers were sent from Sydney, and with them, to take the chief command, Colonel Despard, who had seen much fighting against hill tribes in India. He landed 630 men and 6 cannons. But these latter, being ship's cannons on wooden carriages with small wheels, stuck in the boggy forest roads. The men had to pull the guns, and they were assisted by 250 friendly Maoris. On the evening of the 22nd of June, 1845, they spread out before the pa during the gathering dusk. It was a strong place. In the midst of a deep and gloomy forest, a square had been cleared about 1/3 of a mile in length and in breadth. Great trunks of trees had been set up in the earth, and they stood 15 feet high. Between their great stems, a foot or 18 inches thick, there was just room enough left for firing a musket. 3 rows of these giant palings, with a ditch 5 feet deep between the inner ones, made the fortress most dangerous to assault. And in the ground within, hollows had been dug, where men could sleep secure from shells and rockets. 250 warriors were there with plenty of muskets and powder. On the second morning, the British had got their guns planted within 100 yards of the palisade, but the small balls they threw did little harm to such huge timber. The whole expedition would have had to retire had not a heavier gun come up. This threw shot 32 pounds in weight, and after 26 of these had struck the same place, a breach was seen of a yard or two in width. Colonel Despard ordered 200 men with ropes and hatchets and ladders to be ready for an assault at daybreak. In the still dawn of a wintry morning, the bugles rang out, and the brave fellows gathered for the deadly duty. They rushed at the breach, and for 10 minutes a wild scene ensued. The place was very narrow, and it was blocked by resolute Maoris, who shot down exactly half of the attacking party. Many of the soldiers forced their way through, but only to find a second and then a third palisade in front of them. Then they returned, losing men as they fled, and the whole British force fell back a little way into the forest. That night the groans and cries of the wounded, lying just outside the pa, were mingled with the wild shouts of the war dance within. 2 days later the Maoris hoisted a flag of truce and offered to let the white men carry off the dead and wounded. 34 bodies lay at the fatal breach, and 66 men were found to have been wounded. A week later, another load of cannonballs for the heavy gun was brought up, and the palisades were further broken down. A second assault would have been made, but during the night the Maoris tied up their dogs, and quietly dropping over the palisades at the rear of the pa, got far away into the forest before their retreat was known. For the howling of the dogs all night within the pa kept the officers from suspecting that the Maoris were escaping. The British destroyed the palisades and carried off the stores of potatoes and other provisions which they found inside. 8. Governor Grey. Fitzroy was preparing to chase Heke and Kawiti into their fastnesses when he was recalled. The English government thought he had not acted wisely in some ways, and they blamed him for disobeying their instructions. They had more faith in that young officer, George Grey, who, after exploring in Western Australia, was now the Governor of South Australia. He arrived in November 1845 to take charge of New Zealand, and at once went to Kororarika, where he found 700 soldiers waiting for orders. But he did not wish for fighting if it could be avoided. He sent out a proclamation that Maoris who wished peace were to send in their submission by a certain day. If they did, he would see that the Treaty of Waitangi was kept and that justice was done to them. Hone Heke sent 2 letters, but neither of them was satisfactory, and as more than a year passed without any signs of his submitting, Colonel Despard was directed to go after him. Heke was at a pa called Ikorangi, but Kawiti had 500 Maoris at a nearer pa called Ruapekapika. 9. Ruapekapika. Despard took his men 16 miles in boats up a river, then 9 miles through the forest, and on the 31st of December he had 1,173 soldiers with 450 friendly natives in a camp 800 yards from the pa. It was like the other pas, but bigger and stronger, for behind the palisades there were earthen walls into which cannon balls would only plunge without doing any harm. 3 heavy guns, however, were mounted, and when the Maoris sent up their flag, the first shot was so well aimed as to bring its flagstaff down amid the ringing cheers of the white men. All New Year's Day was spent in pouring in cannonballs by the 100, but they did little harm. Next day the Maoris made a sally, but were driven back with the bayonet. Meantime, Heke came in one night with men to help his friend, and heavy firing on both sides was kept up for a week, after which 2 small breaches appeared near one of the corners of the palisades. The next day was Sunday, which the Maoris thought would be observed as a day of rest, but the soldiers, creeping cautiously up, pushed their way through the breaches. A number of the Maoris ran to arms and fired a volley or 2, but before the main body could do anything, several hundred soldiers were in the place. A stout fight took place, during which 13 white men were killed. The Maoris, now no longer under cover, were no match for the soldiers, and they fled, leaving behind them all the provisions that were to have kept them for a whole season. This discouraged them, and Heke and Kawiti saw their men scatter out and join themselves to the quieter tribes for the sake of food. They therefore wrote to Grey asking peace and promising to give no further trouble. Grey agreed, but left 200 soldiers at Kororarika in order to keep the Maoris of the district in check. 10. Rauparaha. During the 18 months while Heke's war was going on, troubles had been brewing at Wellington, where Rauparaha and Rangiheta kept up an agitation. The latter declared his enmity. He plundered and sometimes killed the settlers, and when soldiers were sent round to keep him in order, he surprised and killed some of them. But Rauparaha pretended to be friendly, though the governor well knew he was the ringleader in the mischief. Grey quietly sent a ship, which by night landed 130 soldiers just in front of Rauparaha's house on the shore. They seized him sleeping in bed, and he was carried round to Auckland, where for some months he was kept a prisoner, though allowed to go about. Rangiheta fled into the wildly wooded mountain ranges of the interior. Once or twice he made a stand, but was driven from his rocky positions, with the slaughter of men on both sides. At last he and his followers scattered out as fugitives into lonely and savage regions into which they could not be followed. Thinking that good roads would do much to keep the country quiet, Grey offered £0.50 a day to Maoris who would work at making roads. Quite a crowd gathered to the task, and for a while white men and Maoris toiled happily together, making good carriage roads into the heart of the country. But at Wanganui in May 1847, land disputes roused a tribe to bloodshed. They killed a white woman and her 4 little children. They attacked the town, and when the inhabitants withdrew to a stockade they had made, a fight took place which lasted for 5 hours, after which the Maoris burnt the town and retreated, carrying off all the cattle. 2 months later, Governor Grey reached Wanganui with 500 men. He chased the Maoris up the valley and fought them, gaining a decisive victory over them with the loss of 2 white men killed. He gave them no rest till the chiefs applied for peace, and early in the next year a meeting was held, and the principal chiefs of the district promised to obey the Queen's laws. The war had lasted 5 years, had cost £1 million, and the lives of 85 white men, beside those of perhaps 100 Maoris. The English government withdrew the larger part of the soldiers from New Zealand, but the colonists, to make themselves safe, enrolled a body they called the New Zealand Fencibles. They were all old soldiers who had retired from the British Army and who were offered little farms and a small payment. 500 came out from England on these terms and were placed in 4 settlements round Auckland for the protection of that town. They were really farmers who were paid to be ready to fight if need should arise. With their wives and children, they made a population of 2,000 souls. In this same year, Rauparaha was allowed to go home. He was surprised at the permission and grateful for it. But he was an old man and died in the following year. In 1850, Hone Heke died, but Rangiheta lingered on till 1856, giving no further trouble. Governor Grey dealt fairly with the Maoris. He paid them for their lands. He hung such white men as murdered them. He set up schools to educate their children, and distributed ploughs and carts, harrows and horses, and even mills, so that they might grow and prepare for themselves better and more abundant food than they had ever known before. End of section 27. Section 28 of History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890 by Alexander and George Sutherland. Section 28. New Zealand, 1843 to 1890. 1. Otago. Meantime, the New Zealand Company had not been idle, and E. G. Wakefield's busy brain was filled with fresh schemes. In 1849, an association had been formed at Glasgow in connection with the Free Church of Scotland to send Scottish families out to New Zealand. Not knowing anything of the country, the new association asked the help of the New Zealand Company, which was readily given, as the new settlers proposed to buy land from the company. In 1844, an exploring party was sent out, and after some inquiry, chose a place on the east coast of the South Island, called Otago. With the consent of the governor, 400,000 acres were there bought from the natives, and it seemed as if a new colony would soon be formed. But the news of the Wairau massacre and the unsettled state of the natives frightened intending settlers for a time. It was not till November 1847 that the John Wycliffe and the Philip Lang sailed from Greenock with the first company of settlers. They reached their new home in March 1848 under the guidance of Captain Cargill, an old soldier who had been chosen as leader of the new settlement. At the head of a fine harbour, which they called Port Chalmers, they laid the foundations of a town, to which they gave the patriotic name of Dunedin, Gaelic for Edinburgh. It was in a fine district, troubled by few natives, and it steadily grew. Less than a year later, it had 745 inhabitants, who could boast of a good jetty and a newspaper. The life of pioneers cannot be very easy, but these were of the right sort and prospered, and more would have joined them but for two circumstances. First came the news of the rich gold discoveries in California, and the most adventurous spirits hurried thither. Not only did this keep settlers from coming to New Zealand, but indeed 1,000 of those she possessed left her shores for the goldfields. Then, in this same year, 1848, a violent earthquake took place, which knocked down £15,000 worth of buildings in Wellington and killed a man with his 2 children. 2. Canterbury. Yet these unlucky accidents only delayed the progress of the colony by a year or two, and in the year 1850 a new settlement was formed. 7 years before this, Wakefield had conceived the idea of a settlement in connection with the Church of England. A number of leading men took up the notion, and among them was the famous Archbishop Whately. An association was formed which bought 20,000 acres of the New Zealand Company's land, to be selected later on. The settlers paid a high price for this land, but the greater part of the money so received was to be used for their own benefit, either in bringing out fresh settlers or in building churches and schools. A bishop and schoolmasters were to go out. A nobleman and other men of wealth bought land and prepared to take stock and servants out to the fine free lands of the south. Wakefield had enlisted in the new scheme a gentleman named John Robert Godley, who became very ardent, and under his direction 3 ships were filled with 600 settlers and their property, and left England on their long voyage to the Antipodes. They reached their destination, the east coast of the South Island, on the 16th of December 1850, and gladly felt the soil of a lovely land under their feet. In their enthusiasm, they sang the national anthem and scattered out to view their new homes. A high and rugged hill prevented their seeing inland till they climbed to its brow, and then they perceived long plains of fertile soil, watered by numerous streams of bright and rapid water. they resolved to found their city on the plains, making only a port upon the seashore. Governor Grey and his wife came over from Wellington to welcome them, and they found that much had been done to make them comfortable. Large sheds had been put up in which they could find shelter till they should build their own homes. A pretty spot by a river named the Avon was chosen for the town, which was laid out in a square, and a church and schoolroom were built among the first erections. In keeping with the religious fervour that lay at the basis of the whole undertaking, the town was called Christchurch, while the name of Lyttelton was given to the seaport, a road being made between the two and over the hill. During the next year, 2,600 settlers arrived. Some of these were young men of birth and fortune, who brought with them everything needed to transplant to New Zealand the luxuries of England. A large proportion of the settlers were labouring men of a superior class, who were brought out as servants at the expense of the wealthy settlers. There was a good deal of disappointment. Many of the labourers crossed over to Australia, where the gold discoveries offered every man a chance of fortune, and where wages were very high. The wealthiest people therefore had to do their own work, and few of them liked it. The result was that many left the settlement and never came back to it. But from Australia came relief, for some of the squatters, who had been dislodged by the inroad of diggers to Victoria, hearing of the great grassy plains of Canterbury, with never a tree to be cleared from the natural pasturage, crossed with flocks of sheep, and bought land in the new settlement. In 1853, Canterbury had 5,000 people. It produced £40,000 worth of wool a year, and 70 vessels reached its seaport. For a place in its third year, such progress was wonderful. 3. New Zealand prosperous. The natives being at peace, and the price of land being reduced, settlers streamed steadily into New Zealand. In 1853, there were 31,000 white people in the colony, and they had bought from the natives 24 million acres of land. They had 1 million of sheep, and their exports were over £300,000 in value. The government was quite solvent again, having a revenue of £140,000 a year. A very large number of farms were by this time in full work, those in the North Island being chiefly used for crops, those in the South Island chiefly for sheep. But the New Zealand Company had disappeared. In 1850 it was £250,000 in debt, and it was wound up, leaving its shareholders with heavy losses. An important event in the history of New Zealand occurred on the 30th of June 1852, when the English Parliament gave the colony power to make its own laws and manage its own affairs, practically without interference from London. A bill was passed providing that there should be 6 provinces, each with its own provincial council, consisting of not less than 9 persons, to be chosen to manage local affairs. There was also to be the General Assembly, consisting of a legislative council appointed by the governor, and a House of Representatives consisting of 40 members, to be chosen by the colonists. The governor, who was now Sir George Grey, did much to bring these new arrangements into force and to adapt them to the needs of the settlers. Having ruled well for 8 years and brought the colony into a prosperous condition, and being required to set in order the affairs of Cape Colony, he left New Zealand on the last day of 1853, much regretted by the Maoris and also by the majority of the colonists. Colonel Wynyard acted as governor for the time being, and summoned the first Parliament of New Zealand to meet in May 1854. He had much difficulty in getting the system of cabinets of responsible ministers to work smoothly. The colonists from different provinces had interests which lay in opposite directions, and political matters did not move easily. He was glad when the new governor, Colonel Gore Brown, arrived in September 1855. At that time, New Zealand had 45,000 white settlers in it, and the discovery next year of rich goldfields in Otago attracted many more, and gave a great impetus to Dunedin. Everything promised a splendid future, when again the Maoris became troublesome. 4. The King Movement. The Waikato tribe had always been averse to the selling of their land. They said truly enough that the money the white men gave for it was soon spent, but the land was gone forever, and the settlers were fencing in 40,000 additional acres every year. They called a meeting on the banks of Lake Taupo to discuss the question. A large number of chiefs were present, and they agreed to form a land league, all members of which undertook to sell no more land to white men. At this time also a new project was formed. The Maoris felt their weakness while divided up into so many tribes. Union would make them strong. They resolved to select one chief to be king of all the Maoris, and for that purpose they chose the redoubted Te Wero, who hoisted the Maori flag. But he was old and inclined to die in peace, and, dying soon afterwards, was succeeded by his son, a young man of no ability. Many of the Maoris held aloof from these leagues. They were of tribes hostile to the Waikatos, or else they were glad to get the white man's money and felt that they had still plenty of land for their own use. But in the heart of the North Island, some 4,000 or 5,000 Maori warriors nursed a wild project of driving the English out of the country. They gathered muskets and powder, they strengthened their paas and filled them with potatoes and yams. Governor Brown took no steps to check them, and suffered several thousand muskets to be bought from English ships along the coasts. 5. Taranaki War. Meantime, a quarrel had been going forward which gave the Maoris a pretext for fighting. In 1859, Governor Brown had visited Taranaki and announced that if any of the natives had land to sell, he was ready to buy it. A Maori offered him 600 acres, proving that he was the owner of the land. The governor gave him £200 for it, but the chief of the tribe to which this Maori belonged was one of the Land League and refused to let the land be sold. The governor, after inquiry, came to the conclusion that as the rightful owner of the land was willing to sell it, no one else had a claim to interfere. He sent surveyors up to measure the land. They were stopped by the chief. The governor sent some soldiers to protect the surveyors. The whole of the Taranaki Maoris rose in arms and swept the few soldiers down to the coast. Then they ravaged the whole district, burning houses, crops and fences, and all the settlers of Taranaki crowded for defence into the town of New Plymouth. Most of them were ruined, and many of them left for other colonies. Governor Brown now sent round from Auckland all the soldiers he had, but, in accordance with their agreement, the Waikato tribes sent warriors to assist the Taranaki tribe. Their Maori king having no great influence, these were placed under the command of Te Waharoa, a Maori chief of much skill and popularity. Many skirmishes took place, in which the natives, through their quickness and subtle plans, inflicted more injury than they received. But General Pratt having arrived from Sydney with fresh soldiers, and prepared to sap the paas and blow them up, the Maoris became afraid, and Te Waharoa proposed that peace should be made, which was done in May 1861. 6. Second Maori War. Governor Brown then called upon the Waikato tribes, who were then in arms, to make submission and take the oath of obedience to the Queen's laws. Very few did so, and when Sir Duncan Cameron arrived to take the chief command with more troops and big guns, he stated that he would invade the Waikato territory and punish those tribes for their disobedience. But then came news that the English government, being dissatisfied with the way in which matters were drifting into war, was going to send back Sir George Grey. He arrived in September 1861 to take the place of Colonel Brown, and after a month or two summoned a great meeting of the Waikatos to hear him speak. They gathered and discussed the land question. Grey said that those who did not wish to sell their land could keep it by the Treaty of Waitangi, but that no one must hinder another man from selling what was his own. The land for which Governor Brown had given £200 at Taranaki was still in the occupation of armed Maoris, and it must be given up. Grey reasoned with them, but they were obstinate. Bishop Selwyn went among them and exhorted them to peace, but made no impression. Meanwhile, General Cameron set his men at work to make roads, and during the year and a half, while the governor was trying to bring the Maoris to reason, he was making good military highways throughout the North Island. In October 1862, the Maoris held another great meeting among themselves to discuss their position. They had grown confident and thought that the governor's mildness arose from weakness. They resolved to fight. The governor sent soldiers to take possession of the land at Taranaki. Te Waharoa sent word to the Taranaki Maoris to begin shooting, and he would soon be with them. He was as good as his word, and laid a trap for a body of English soldiers and killed 10 of them. The Waikatos sent an embassy to all the other tribes, urging them to join and drive the white men out of the country. Te Waharoa was chosen to command in a grand attack at Auckland, and for that purpose the Maoris in 2 columns moved stealthily through the forest down the Waikato Valley towards the town, threatening to massacre every white man in it. But General Cameron was there in time to meet them. They fell back to a line of rifle pits they had formed, and from that shelter did much damage to the British troops. But at last the Maoris were dislodged and chased with bayonets up the Waikato, losing 50 of their men. They had stronger entrenchments farther up, where 1,000 men were encamped, with women to cook for them and to make cartridges. So strongly were they posted that Cameron waited for 4 months, whilst guns and supplies were being brought up along the roads, which were now good and well made. By getting round to the side of their camp and behind it, he made it necessary for them to fall back again, which they did. 7. Rangariri. They now made themselves very secure at a place called Rangariri, where a narrow road was left between the Waikato River and a boggy lake. This space they had blocked with a fence of thick trees 20 feet high, and with 2 ditches running across the whole length. In the midst of this strong line they had set up a redoubt, a sort of square fortress, from the walls of which they could fire down upon the attackers in any direction. About 500 Maoris well armed took up their position in this stronghold. Cameron advanced against them with 770 men and 2 guns, each throwing shot of 40 pounds weight. At the same time, 4 gunboats with 500 soldiers were sent up the river to take the Maori position in flank. At 4:30 on a July morning, the British bugles sounded the attack, and the fight lasted until the darkness of night put an end to it. During that fierce day, the British charged again and again, to be met by a murderous fire from behind the palisades and from the walls of the redoubt. 41 soldiers had been killed and 91 wounded. The line of palisades had been captured, but the Maoris had all gathered safely within the redoubt. During the night, the troops were quartered all round so as to prevent them from escaping, and a trench was cut to lead to a mine under the redoubt so that it could be blown up with gunpowder in the morning. The Maoris saw this project and could not prevent it. In the early dawn, after a night spent in war dances and hideous yelling, some of them burst out by the side towards the lake and rushed past or jumped over the soldiers who were resting there. A heavy fire, poured into them from their rear, killed a great many of them. Seeing this, a large party of the Maoris, and among them Te Waharoa and the Maori king, stayed in the redoubt. But they knew that they were trapped, and next day they surrendered. In all 183 men, with a few women. 60 or 70 of the Maoris had been killed, but several hundreds escaped. 8. Oricau. Meantime, General Carey, who was next in command to General Cameron, had been chasing another large body of the Waikato tribe far up the river, more than halfway to its source in Lake Taupo. It was a wild and mountainous district, and the Maoris were sheltered at Oracau, a pa in a very strong position. Carey spent 3 days in running a mine under the walls, while his guns and mortars kept up a perfect storm of shot and shell. Then he offered to accept their surrender. They refused to give in. He begged them at least to let the women and children go, and they would be allowed to pass out unhurt. They said that men and women would fight for ever and ever. Yet when the mines began to burst and the guns poured in redoubled showers of death, they found that they could hold the place no longer. They formed a column and made a sudden rush to escape. So quick were they, and so favourable the ground, that they would have escaped if the British had not had a body of 300 or 400 cavalry, who rode after them and sabred all who would not surrender. About 200 were killed, and although several hundreds escaped, yet they were so dispersed that they made no further stand. They left their pas, and though a series of skirmishes took place, yet the Waikato rebellion was ended, and Cameron had only to leave a sufficient number of military settlers along the Waikato Valley to make certain that peace and order would be maintained. End of section 28. Section 29 of History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890 by Alexander and George Sutherland. Section 29. 9. The Gate Pa. There was a tribe at Tauranga on the Bay of Plenty with whom Governor Grey was displeased, for they had sent men, guns, and food to help the Waikatos, and they showed a warlike disposition. He demanded their submission, and they refused it. He then sent General Cameron with 1,500 soldiers to deal with them. This force found the Tauranga tribe prepared to fight in a strong place called the Gate Pa, built on a ridge with a swamp at each side. They had 500 men in it, all well armed. Cameron had 3 heavy guns placed in position, and during the night 700 soldiers passed round one of the swamps to get at the rear of the Maoris. In the morning a terrific fire was opened, and for 2 hours the place was swept with shot and shell. But the Maoris had dug underground shelters for themselves and were little injured. After that the guns were used to break a hole in the palisades, and at 4 o'clock there was a sufficient breach to admit an attacking party. 300 men were chosen and put in front of the place. A rocket was sent up as a signal, and the attacking party dashed at the breach. As they entered it, not a Maori could be seen, but puffs of smoke all along the earthen bank showed where they were concealed. The assailants were a dense crowd on whom every shot told. All the officers were killed. More men kept crowding in, only to drop before the murderous fire. Suddenly a panic seized the men. A rush was made to get out of the breach again, and while the soldiers were running away, volley after volley was fired into the crowd. General Cameron did not renew the attack, for evening was falling. There came on a dark, wet night, and although surrounded on all hands, the Maoris contrived to slip gently past the sentries, leaving some wounded men behind them. 10. Tauranga. The Maoris fell back a few miles and chose a strong position at Tauranga for a new pa. They had only dug the ditches and made some rifle pits when the British were upon them. The troops carried the position with a rush, the Maoris standing up against the bayonets with the coolest courage. A hand-to-hand fight forced the natives out of the ditches, and then they turned and fled. The horse soldiers pursued and killed many. Altogether, 123 of the Maoris were killed, and a large number captured, while the English lost 10 men killed. 11. Werraroa. After this action, though skirmishes were frequent, the Maoris made no determined stand, and on the English side affairs were carried on in a slow fashion. General Cameron had under him 10,000 regular soldiers and nearly 10,000 colonial volunteers. He had nearly a dozen vessels of different sorts, either on the coasts or up the river, and he had an abundance of heavy guns. There arose quarrels between him and the governor, who thought that with less than 1,000 Maoris under arms, more progress ought to have been made. General Cameron resigned and departed in the middle of 1865. The governor wished him, before he went, to attack a pa called Werraroa, but the general said he required 2,000 more men to do it, and refused. Yet Sir George Grey, taking himself the command of the colonial forces, captured the fort without losing a man. The bulk of the Maoris escaped, and kept up for a time a guerrilla warfare in forests and on mountain sides. But at last the Tauranga tribes, or the miserable remnant that was left, surrendered to the governor. Grey, in admiration of their generous and often noble conduct and their straightforward mode of fighting, allowed all the prisoners to go free, and though he punished them by confiscating a quarter of their land, he did his best to settle them on the other 3/4 in peace and with such advantages as British help could secure them. So there came quietness round the Bay of Plenty. 12. The How religion. Meantime, new trouble was brewing in the Taranaki district. There the soldiers were skirmishing with the Maoris, but had them well in control, when a pair of mad or crafty native priests set the tribes in wild commotion by declaring that the angel Gabriel had told them in a vision that at the end of the year 1864 all white men would be driven out of New Zealand, that he himself would defend the Maoris, and that the Virgin Mary would always be with them, that the religion of the white men was false, and that legions of angels would come and teach the Maoris a better religion. In the meantime, all good Maoris who shouted the word how as they went into battle would be victorious, and angels would protect their lives. A body of these fanatics, deeply impressed with the belief in these and many other follies, tried their fortunes against the soldiers at Taranaki, but with small success. 40 of them, in spite of shouting their how, fell before the muskets and guns of the white men. Then 300 of them made an effort in another direction, and, moving down the river Wanganui, threatened the little town at its mouth. Wanganui was defended by 300 soldiers, but all the out-settlers up the valley were leaving their farms and hurrying in for shelter, when 300 men of the Wanganui tribe, who liked the white men and were friendly with them, offered to fight the How-Hows. The challenge was accepted, and about 200 of the fanatics landed on a little island called Mutoa in the middle of the river. Though surrounded by a pretty margin of white pebbles, it was covered with ferns and thick scrub. Through this, at daybreak, the combatants crept towards each other, the How-Hows gesticulating and making queer sounds. At last they fell to work, and volley after volley was discharged at only 10 yards distance. The friendly natives, having seen 3 of their chiefs fall, turned and fled. Many had plunged into the river, when one of their chiefs made a stand at the end of the island, and gathering 20 men around him, poured in a volley and killed the How-How leader. This surprised the fanatics, and they hesitated. Then a second volley and a charge routed them. Back came the friendly Maoris who had fled, and chased their enemies into the stream, wherein a heavy slaughter took place. About 70 of the How-Hows were slain. The 12 who fell on the friendly side were buried in Wanganui with military honours, and a handsome monument now marks the place where their bones rest. 13. Conclusion of Maori Wars. In 1866, General Shute came to take command of the troops in place of General Cameron. A vigorous campaign crushed the Howhows after much skirmishing in different parts of the Wellington district. But the chief trouble arose from another source. The 183 prisoners taken at Rangariri, together with some others taken afterwards, were detained on board a hulk near Auckland. Sir George Grey wished to deal in a kindly fashion with them and proposed to release them if they gave their word not to give further trouble. The ministers of his cabinet were against this proposal, but agreed that he should send them to an island near Auckland to live there without any guards. They gave their promise, but broke it, and all but 4 escaped, Te Waharoa being among them. They chose the top of a circular hill 35 miles from Auckland, and there fortified themselves in a pa called Omaha. But they did no harm to anyone, and as they soon quietly dispersed, they were not meddled with. A wild outburst of How fanaticism on the east coast of the Bay of Plenty stirred up the fires of discord again, when a worthy old Church of England missionary named Mr. Volkner was seized, and after some savage rites had been performed, was hanged on a willow tree as a victim. More fighting followed, in which a large share was taken by a Maori chief named Ropata, who, clad in European uniform and with the title of Major of Ropata, fought stoutly against the Howhows and captured several pars. 14. Te Kuti. When the last of these pars was captured, an English officer declared that one of the friendly chiefs named Te Kuti was playing false and acting as a spy. Thinking to do as Governor Grey had done with Rauparaha, this officer seized the chief, who, without trial of any sort, was sent off to the Chatham Islands, a lonely group 300 miles away, which New Zealand was now using as a penal establishment for prisoners. This conduct was quite unfair, as Te Kuti, so far as can now be known, was not a spy and was friendly to the English. Nearly 300 Maoris were on the Chatham Islands, most of them How prisoners. They were told that if they behaved well, they would be allowed to return in 2 years. When 2 years were past and no signs of their liberation appeared, Te Kuti planned a bold escape. An armed schooner, the Rifleman, having come in with provisions, the Maoris suddenly overpowered the 12 soldiers who formed their guard and seized the vessel. 1 soldier was killed whilst fighting, but all the rest were treated gently. The whole of the Maoris went on board, and then the crew were told that unless they agreed to sail the vessel back to New Zealand, they would all be killed. Day and night Maori guards patrolled the deck during the voyage, and one of them, with loaded gun and drawn sword, always stood over the helmsman and compelled him to steer them home. They reached the shores of New Zealand a little north of Hawke Bay and landed, taking with them all the provisions out of the vessel, but treating the crew in a kindly way. A ship was sent round with soldiers who attacked the runaways, but they were too few and too hastily prepared, so that Te Kuti easily defeated them. 3 times was he attacked by different bodies of troops, and 3 times did he drive off his assailants. Cutting a path for himself through the forests, he forced his way 100 miles inland to a place of security. But his people had no farms and no means of raising food in these wild mountain regions, and the provisions they had taken from the Rifleman were used in a few months. 15. Poverty Bay Massacre. Then, roused to madness by hunger, of which some of them had died, they crept cautiously back to the Poverty Bay district. Falling at night upon the little village, they slaughtered men, women, and children, as well as all the quiet Maoris they could catch. The dawn woke coldly on a silent village, wherein 50 or 60 bodies lay gashed and mangled in their beds, or at their doors, or upon their garden paths. An old man and a boy escaped by hiding. After taking all the provisions out of the place, Taikuti set fire to the houses and retreated to the hills, where, on the top of a peak 2,000 feet high, he had made a pa called Ngata Pa, which was defended on every side by precipices and deep gorges. There was only one narrow approach, and that had been fortified with immense care. The colonial troops under Colonel Whitmore and bodies of friendly Maoris under Rapata attacked him here. The work was very difficult, for after climbing those precipitous hills there were 2 palisades to be carried, one 7 feet high and the other 12. But science prevailed. After great exertions and appalling dangers, the place was captured by Rapata, who climbed the cliffs and gained a corner of the palisades, killing a great number of Taikuti's men in the action. During the night the rest escaped from the pa, sliding from the cliffs by means of ropes. But in the morning they were chased, and for 2 days the fugitives were brought back to the pa in 2s and 3s. Rapata took it for granted that they were all concerned in the massacre at Poverty Bay. Each of the captives, as he arrived, was stripped, taken to the edge of the cliff, shot dead, and his body thrown over. About 120 were thus slaughtered. But Taikuti himself escaped, and for the next 2 years he lived the life of a hunted animal, chased through the gloomy forests by the relentless Rapata. He fought many fights. His 20 How followers were often near to death from starvation, but at length wearied out, he threw himself on the mercy of the white men, was pardoned, sunk into obscurity, and died in peace. War was not really at an end till 1871, as up to that date occasional skirmishes took place, but there never was any fear of a general rising of the Maoris after 1866. 16. Progress of New Zealand. These wars were confined to the North Island. Otago, Canterbury and Neilson felt them only by way of increased taxes. Otherwise they were left in peace to pursue their quiet progress. They multiplied their population 6-fold. They opened up the country with good roads. A railway was cut through the mountain to join Christchurch with its seaport Lyttelton by a tunnel 1/2 mile long. A similar but easier railway was made to join Dunedin to Port Chalmers. Gold was found in various parts, especially in Otago and on the west coast round Hokitika. For a time New Zealand sent out gold every year to the value of £2.5 million, and this lucrative pursuit brought thousands of stout settlers to her shores. In 1864, the New Zealand Parliament chose Wellington to be the capital of the colony, as being more central than Auckland. In 1868, an act was passed to abolish the provinces and to make New Zealand more completely a united colony. A great change began in this same year, when the first Maori chief was elected to be a member of the New Zealand Parliament. Before long, there were 6 Maoris seated there, 2 of them being in the upper house. These honourable concessions, together with a fairer treatment in regard to their land, did much to show the Maoris that their lives and liberties were respected by the white men. They had lost much land, but what was left was now of more use to them than the whole had formerly been. Their lives and their property were now safer than ever, and they learnt that to live as peaceful subjects of Queen Victoria was the happiest course they could follow. The government built schools for them and sent teachers. It built churches for them and cared for them in many ways. Thus they became well satisfied, even if they sometimes remembered with regret the freer life of the olden times. But Sir George Grey, who was the warm friend of the Maori, was no longer governor. He had finished his work and his term of office had expired. Sir George Bowen came out to take his place. Grey, after a trip to England, returned to take up his residence in New Zealand, and a few years later allowed himself to be elected a member of its Parliament. Subsequently, he became its Prime Minister, sinking his own personal pride in his desire to do good to the country. From 1870 to 1877, the affairs of the country were chiefly directed by ministries in which Sir Julius Vogel was the principal figure. He started and carried out a bold policy of borrowing and spending the money so obtained in bringing out fresh settlers and in opening up the land by railways. This plan plunged the colony deeply into debt, but it changed the look of the place, and although it had its dangers and its drawbacks, it has done a great deal for the colony. At first, the natives refused to let the railways pass through their districts, but in 1872 a great meeting of chiefs agreed that it would be good for all to have the country opened up. Some maintained a dull hostility till 1881, but all the same the railways were made until at length 2,000 miles were open for traffic. Between 1856 and 1880, 19 different ministries managed the affairs of New Zealand, one after the other, the same Prime Minister, however, presiding over different ministries. The most notable of these have been Sir William Fox, Edward W. Stafford, Major Atkinson, and Sir Julius Vogel. In 1880, the colony had increased to 500,000 white people, owning 12 million sheep and exporting nearly £6 million worth of goods. The Maoris were 44,000, but while the whites were rapidly increasing, the Maoris were somewhat decreasing. They had 112,000 sheep and nearly 50,000 cattle, with about 100,000 pigs. The heavy expenditure of the borrowing years, from 1870 to 1881, was followed by a time of depression from 1880 to 1890, during which Sir Robert Stout and Major Atkinson were Prime Ministers. But at the end of that period, the colony began rapidly to recover. Its population approached 750,000, with 42,000 Maoris. Its sheep were nearly 20 million in number, and its farms produced 20 million bushels of wheat and oats. It sent £4 million worth of wool to England and about £1 million worth of frozen meat. The general history of the last 20 years may be summed up as consisting of immense progress in all material and social interests. End of section 29. End of History of Australia and New Zealand from 1696 to 1890 by Alexander and George Sutherland.